I didn't even know that button exists. Good morning. We got one more coming in right now, and we're going to get started. I want to welcome our panel of witnesses. Today we have Kevin McAleenan, the Commissioner of the CBP. We have Matthew Albans and Derek Benner, Executive Directors for ICE, Enforcement and Removal Operations, and ICE Homeland Security Investigations. Commissioner, we visited yesterday. It was a good visit. And while we've known each other for a while, today is our first time that you've appeared, I believe, as the confirmed Commissioner of CBP. Congratulations on your confirmation. The subcommittee is holding a hearing on the budget request for two DHS components, ICE and CBP, for a couple of reasons. First, it's practical. Given the late start for the fiscal 19 budget hearing cycle, we're operating on a compressed schedule in order to meet this committee's objectives of completing the Homeland Security Appropriations Bill in July. Second, having ICE and CBP testify together provides an opportunity to hear how they operate jointly and how those operations inform the budget requests. The fiscal year 2019 budget request for CBP is $14.2 billion, an increase of $218 million above the amount provided in fiscal year 2018. This includes $1.6 billion for new physical barriers. There are legitimate questions about the request that requires answers. For example, spending is proposed for various types of barriers, but it's unclear where they will be located or if they can be executed in fiscal year 2019. Likewise, we need to understand how this budget request supports security at the ports of entry. Fiscal year 2018 budget request for ICE is $8.8 billion in discretionary spending, an increase of $1.4 billion over fiscal year 2018. The largest share of the increase supports the hiring of 2,000 ICE agents and 52,000 detention beds. The subcommittee needs to understand how fiscal year 2018 appropriations may be impacted by these requests. We want to work with you and make sure that the fiscal year 19 funding builds on the work we will accomplish this year. Before I turn to our witnesses for their statements, the text of which is included in the record, I'd like to recognize my distinguished ranking member, Ms. Roble Allard, for any remarks she may wish to make.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome Commissioner McAleenan, Associate Director Albans, and Associate Director Benner. I'll make my opening statements very brief so that we can maximize the time for questions. Commissioner McAleenan, congratulations on your recent confirmation. We have spoken about the significant challenges you and CBP face, and I want to reaffirm my commitment to helping you address those challenges. As you know, I disagree with the approach of the current administration in some areas, but there is no disagreement on the need to continue building on the significant progress made over the last decade in border security, both between the ports of entry and at the ports. And there is a broad consensus on continuing to invest in improvements at the ports that will better facilitate the flow of commerce. Mr. Albans and Mr. Benner, I regret that Dr. Homan was unable to join us this morning, but I am glad to have you both here to answer our questions. Director Homan and I have had frank, respectful discussions about our disagreements on ICE policies and priorities. And while we won't resolve those disagreements this morning, I appreciate his willingness to maintain open lines of communication. A high priority for me is ensuring that individuals in the custody of your agencies are treated fairly and humanely and according to appropriate standards. No matter the policy disagreements we have, I hope we can work constructively together in that area. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to our discussion this morning.
Thank you, Ms. Roble-Allard. We are joined by the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Lowy. Ms. Lowy is recognized for any statements she wishes to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to thank Chairman Carter and Ranking Member Roybal-Allard for holding this important hearing, and thank you to each of the witnesses for being here this morning. I want to be very clear. Your agencies are critically important to the security of this country. Ensuring the integrity of our borders and enforcing immigration laws are difficult but necessary jobs, and we appreciate the hard work and dedication of the thousands of personnel at both CBP and ICE. Congress must carefully prioritize efficient use of taxpayer dollars to protect our security, grow the economy, and facilitate trade and safe travels. Democrats fundamentally disagree with this administration's politicization of border security and its often heartless decisions and priorities on immigration enforcement. Long-standing practice has been to prioritize removal efforts on those convicted of serious crimes, not our neighbors, who have lived here for decades, working hard, contributing to our economy, and raising families. Yet, for CBP, the budget request includes $1.6 billion for 65 miles of border wall and $164 million to hire 750 new Border Patrol agents and 153 support personnel. CBP has not yet explained why these funds are needed at a time when apprehensions at the border are still historically low, and many of those apprehended are surrendering themselves to Border Patrol. The president's obsession with fulfilling his campaign promise for a border wall remains deeply concerning. The deployment of the National Guard is yet another misguided and impulsive decision that the department is being forced to justify, while other national security priorities are being stretched thin. For ICE, the budget requests an increase of 11,500 beds and the hiring of 3,300 new personnel, including 2,000 new law enforcement positions. Those increases are clearly included to support the administration's overly aggressive and unacceptable interior enforcement policies. Finally, the administration proposes to change the law to tie the hands of state and local law enforcement on how best to police their communities and to authorize DHS and DOJ to condition certain grants on a jurisdiction's cooperation with ICE. This runs contrary to federal court precedent, could result in victims of crime staying in the shadows, reduces trust between law enforcement and the public. Quite simply, it will make our communities less safe. President Trump continues to speak and tweet extensively and inappropriately, often outlining his draconian plans to detain and deport as many people as possible. The most prominent increases in this budget are rooted in that ugly sentiment. It's unconscionable and unacceptable. This budget request does not reflect the serious nature of the threats we face. Well over a year after the 2016 election, it's time we move on from empty campaign threats and start focusing on what is needed to keep American families safe. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again.
Well, thank you. And I think that concludes our opening statements. We'll allow to hear your testimony at this time. Commissioner.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Carter, Ranking Member Roybal-Allard, full committee Ranking Member Anita Lowy, and members of the subcommittee. I really appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. I've had the chance to engage with this subcommittee many times in many different capacities over the years, and I've always appreciated the deep expertise and commitment to support our critical mission from both members and staff. And as you noted, Mr. Chairman, this is my first chance to appear as a commissioner of CBP, and it is a sincere honor to represent the 60,000-strong men and women of U.S. Customs and Border Protection in that role. CBP carries out three core missions critical to our national security and economic prosperity: counterterrorism, border security, and securing and facilitating international trade and travel. The President's fiscal year 2019 budget includes a total of $14.2 billion to enable CBP to achieve our complex mission with the right combination of dedicated personnel, risk-based strategies, collaborative partnerships, advanced technology, and tactical infrastructure. Before discussing the FY 2019 budget, I would like to briefly address the recently passed Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2018. I would like to thank this subcommittee for your support of CBP's mission, including the largest investment in border wall in more than a decade. We are already putting this funding to work on behalf of the American people. CBP has worked closely with this committee in recent years to continually improve our ability to support our budget requests with operator-derived, data-supported, and rigorously analyzed requirements. I look forward to continue working with you to ensure that the funding we request supports our highest priority needs. The FY 2019 budget request includes continued investments in key mission areas. With regard to border security, the President's budget requests $1.6 billion to be applied toward the construction of 65 miles of border wall system, a need identified by the field and supported by CBP's full spectrum requirements analysis process. In conjunction with border wall system, technology is a force multiplier in the border environment that increases situational awareness and decreases risk to the safety of our frontline personnel. The budget request proposes investing $220 million in the sustainment and continued deployment of technology to strengthen border security operations between the ports of entry in the land, air, and maritime environments. The FY 2019 budget seeks to build on this momentum by requesting, the budget also recognizes, and this is obviously a critical topic for our hearing today, that the men and women of CBP are our greatest assets. I am very proud of their dedication, integrity, and commitment. But CBP has faced challenges in meeting our hiring goals in the past several years. However, due to 40 individual enhancements to CBP's hiring process, we are seeing improved results despite record low unemployment around the United States and intense competition for highly qualified, mission-inspired people. Several key indicators are moving in a positive direction. CBP's hiring totals last year surpassed the prior year by 14%, and we estimate that we will increase the number of Border Patrol agents and CBP officers hired in FY 18 as well. The total number of frontline applicants has increased, and we intend to make progress with targeted digital recruiting. Further, attrition dropped last year. Our applicant to successful hire ratio has improved significantly, and we are making improvements to our polygraph process. I am keenly aware that we are not where we need to be in this area. In hiring and sustaining a world-class law enforcement workforce will continue to be my highest mission support priority for U.S. Customs and Border Protection. There is simply no area where we are working harder. We want to build on this momentum in 2019 by requesting $46 million for recruitment and applicant processing transformation. This will support the requested increase of $164 million to hire, train, and equip an additional 750 Border Patrol agents from the FY 2018 requested levels. Importantly, this budget also includes an additional $45 million to continue to support the operational mobility program that helps reduce Border Patrol agent attrition and staff hard-to-fill locations. The 19 budget request also supports critical investments in facilities our agents operate in every day, including $33 million to construct a new Border Patrol station in Freer, Texas. At our nation's ports of entry, the men and women of CBP prevent dangerous people, contraband, and plant pests and animal diseases from entering the United States while facilitating the flow of lawful trade and travel. The budget request includes $44 million to build upon and recapitalize CBP's non-intrusive inspection technology. NII helps CBP interdict illicit narcotics, including opioids and synthetics like fentanyl, at our ports of entry and our international mail and express consignment facilities. Additionally, the budget proposes an increase of $27 million for improved intelligence and targeting capabilities at CBP's National Targeting Center. The NTC works to effectively identify and interdict travelers and cargo that may pose a threat to the United States. CBP's trade facilitation and trade enforcement role is critical to our nation's economic security. The budget request includes $2 million for 26 positions to support CBP's ongoing implementation of the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act. The request also includes an increase of $5.5 million to develop and deploy additional functionality in our Automated Commercial Environment, or ACE, the single window for submission of trade data to the U.S. government. With the ongoing support of Congress, CBP will continue to secure our nation's borders while facilitating international trade and travel. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to appear before you today. I look forward to your questions.
Good morning. Chairman Carter, Ranking Member Roybal-Allard, Ranking Member Lowy, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to present the overall President's fiscal year 2019 budget for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and specifically to discuss enforcement and removal operations and my role as the Executive Associate Director of ERO. ICE's mission is to protect America from the cross-border crime and illegal immigration that threaten national security and public safety. To protect the security of the American people in the homeland, ICE vigilantly enforces the nation's immigration and customs laws by focusing on immigration enforcement, preventing terrorism, and combating transnational organized crime. In the face of heightened scrutiny, I am extremely proud that our men and women continue to operate with professionalism and honor and do so at the risk of their own safety and security. The President's FY19 budget request for ICE includes $8.3 billion to meet our diverse mission requirements and to make much-needed investments in immigration enforcement, criminal investigations, workforce expansion, and training. These requested enhancements continue our FY18 efforts to control illegal immigration, enhance interior enforcement, particularly against criminal aliens and habitual immigration offenders, combat the growing national opioid and other dangerous drug epidemic, and increase our ability to detect, disrupt, and deter human smuggling and child exploitation operations so often associated with transnational criminal organizations. ICE appreciates the continued support of Congress in building a stronger ICE, one that can meet the myriad critical operational responsibilities necessary for the safety and security of our country. To accomplish this, it is imperative that ICE is properly resourced to support these diverse mission requirements, making the need for additional funding and personnel more crucial than ever. That is why our FY19 budget makes a significant down payment on ICE's workforce, requesting $571 million for an additional 2,000 law enforcement officers and vital support personnel impacting all aspects of our mission space. In particular, ERO operates in an incredibly challenging environment. What ERO and ICE in general does not do is conduct indiscriminate raids or sweeps. We conduct targeted enforcement operations across the country every day that are based on intelligence-driven leads and detailed investigations, prioritizing our resources on identifying and removing public safety and national security threats. We also prioritize fugitives and aliens who have illegally entered the United States after having previously been removed, a federal felony, and one that ERO prosecuted over 4,200 times last year. But to be clear, entering the United States illegally is a crime in and of itself, and ICE's congressionally mandated mission is to enforce immigration law as enacted by Congress. To that end, last fiscal year, ERO made substantial progress in focusing its limited enforcement resources on arresting and removing public safety threats from our communities and restoring fidelity to the immigration system, especially for those aliens with orders of removal issued by an immigration judge. In FY 2017, 89% of the aliens arrested by ERO in the interior of the United States had a prior interaction with the criminal justice system, with 74% of them being convicted criminals. In real terms, this means that nearly 11,000 more criminal aliens were removed from the street last fiscal year than in FY 16. These positive trends have continued in FY 18, with criminal alien arrests up over 8% and overall arrests up nearly 30%. Also, despite the challenges faced in some jurisdictions, ERO has continued to strengthen its relationship with the state and local law enforcement community. For example, the 287G program has increased from 32 to 76 partnerships, with continued interest from other jurisdictions. Further, working cooperatively with our tremendous partners at the National Sheriff's Association and Major County Sheriffs of America, we have established a new process that affords our local partners an additional legal basis to defend themselves when they faithfully execute their public safety duties by detaining aliens at ICE's request. To continue to build on this significant progress, ERO needs the resources requested in the FY19 budget. Recent statistics and our own staffing model indicate that a substantial increase in deportation officers is required to respond to manage the more than 2.5 million aliens on the detained and non-detained dockets, manage an increased detained population, and address the over 540,000 immigration fugitives, aliens who have had their day in court and have failed to comply with the judge's removal order. Further, due to the challenges facing some of our law enforcement partners inhibiting their ability to honor ICE detainers or even share information, it is necessary to place more ICE officers within state and local jails, as well as augment our fugitive operations teams in order to ensure that dangerous criminals are not reintroduced into American communities where they can further victimize our law-abiding citizens. Additionally, more attorneys are needed to support an ever-increasing caseload and to meet the Department of Justice's planned national expansion within EOIR. The increased immigration enforcement workforce request also necessitates a commensurate increase in detention beds to process the identified illegal immigration population and detain CBP apprehensions of illegal border crossers. While the FY18 Consolidated Appropriation Act provided ICE with funding for 40,520 detention beds, the requirement remains almost 11,000 beds higher in FY19. Through the use of the ICE statistical bed model and associated operational factors, ICE estimates the need for detention beds at 52,000 for FY19. This is a sophisticated model that has previously been shared with your staffs and has proven to be highly accurate at forecasting detention needs. The FY19 budget also includes an increase in funding for expanded transportation costs related to both domestic and international movement of aliens. ERO has worked diligently to obtain greater cooperation from foreign governments to accept their citizens, with the number of recalcitrant countries dropping from 20 to 9, and those at risk of noncompliance dropping from 55 to 36. However, the cost of removing these aliens is extensive, and ERO requires additional funds to ensure that these and other illegal aliens, many violent criminals, are removed from our country. Overall, the resultant FY19 ERO budget request is $5.1 billion to identify, arrest, detain, and remove illegal aliens. Since its inception 15 years ago, ICE continues to be a preeminent federal law enforcement agency with a unique and critical role in the national security and public safety of the United States, as well as an invaluable partner among the international law enforcement community. With a diverse and dedicated workforce and a wealth of experience throughout our ranks and on the front lines, we are 20,000 American patriots in proud service to our country. Many of our personnel put their lives on the line every day to protect our nation, despite the innumerable challenges they face, and I could not be more honored to represent them here today. With your support, I believe ICE is well-positioned to have an even greater impact on the safety and security of this country, and we will continue to execute our sworn duties with integrity, courage, and excellence. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today and for your continued support of ICE. I look forward to answering any questions you may have at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Benner.
Chairman Carter, Ranking Member Roybal Allard, full committee Ranking Member Lowy, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I want to thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to present the President's fiscal year 19 budget for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, but specifically for Homeland Security investigations portion of the request. The ICE Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI, Directorate is a critical asset in the ICE mission, responsible for investigating a wide range of domestic and international activities arising from the illegal movement of people and goods into, within, and out of the United States. HSI uses its legal authority to investigate issues such as smuggling of narcotics, the smuggling of weapons, financial crimes, cybercrime, trade enforcement crimes, export enforcement, human rights violations, and human smuggling. HSI special agents also conduct investigations aimed at protecting critical infrastructure industries that are vulnerable to sabotage, attack, or exploitation. In my limited time today, I want to highlight several priorities within HSI's broad mission set that we believe are relevant to our discussion of the fiscal year 19 budget and HSI's contribution to the administration's and Congress's priorities. First and foremost, HSI's strategy to address the smuggling of fentanyl and other illicit opioids focuses on working at every level of the illicit supply chain. HSI's investigations focused on the point of foreign manufacture, the dark net and illicit marketplaces, and the payment mechanisms used by buyers and sellers throughout the smuggling pipeline, and most importantly, with our state and local partners, tying overdose deaths to smuggling networks that supply the illicit substance. HSI has seen a rapid growth in our fentanyl-related investigations and seizures in just the last 2 years. For instance, between fiscal year 15 and fiscal year 17, fentanyl seizures and investigations have increased from 69 pounds of fentanyl in fiscal year 15 to 2,400 pounds in fiscal year 17. We anticipate this increase in seizures and investigations will continue in fiscal year 18. The Border Enforcement Security Task Forces, or BESS, are ICE's primary platform to investigate opioid smuggling domestically. ICE currently operates BESS in 62 locations throughout the United States. An increase of 30% in fiscal year 17 in response to the President's executive order on transnational criminal organizations, BESS leveraged the participation of more than 1,000 federal, state, local, and foreign law enforcement agents and officers representing over 100 law enforcement agencies that target opioid smuggling. Similarly, HSI's cyber investigations related to fentanyl and other illicit opioids have increased by 400% between those two fiscal years, 15 and 17. In response to the executive order and to improve our ability to tie overdose deaths here in the United States to the smuggling networks, HSI has developed a dark web and cryptocurrency training program for state and local law enforcement. Training for those investigators and officers that are involved in drug and suspicious death investigations. So far, in 2018, HSI has delivered training to more than 1,200 investigators from state, local, tribal, and federal agencies. Secondly, combating MS-13. In addition to protecting the homeland from illicit opioids, HSI further enhances public safety by targeting transnational criminal organizations and criminal street gangs that operate in the United States. HSI has been laser focused on MS-13 for more than a decade, and through Operation Community Shield, the primary platform through which HSI executes its anti-gang initiatives. In October of 2012, for example, HSI worked with U.S. Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control to designate MS-13 as the first transnational criminal street gang identified as a TCO. As a result of this designation, any property or property interest in the United States or in the possession or control of a U.S. person in which MS-13 has an interest are blocked. One of our most important partners in our fight against MS-13 is the government of El Salvador, who we partner with daily. And I just returned from El Salvador last Friday, and I look forward to discussing that later in my testimony. HSI has established a transnational criminal investigative unit with the government of El Salvador National Police, which makes it possible to extend the reach and impact of our domestic investigations into El Salvador, ensuring that gang leadership in El Salvador is also held accountable for the gang's criminal conduct in the United States. From fiscal year 05 to present, HSI has effected over 57,000 criminal arrests of gang members, including over 7,300 MS-13 members. The DHS efforts to secure our border will not be effective unless we simultaneously focus on the magnets and the pull factors that are drawing people to cross our borders illegally, at the same time that we focus on physical border security. Acting ICE Director Homan has set a high bar for HSI's worksite enforcement efforts in 2018 and going forward. Consistent with his public statements that ICE will no longer exempt any industry or business sector from worksite enforcement, HSI focuses on the entire economy and geographic area of the United States. Our strategy incorporates a multi-pronged approach to utilize enforcement, criminal arrests of employers and administrative arrests of employees, compliance, employment verification inspections, civil fines, and debarment, and outreach, the ICE mutual agreement between government and employers to instill a culture of compliance and accountability. In support of our efforts to instill a culture of compliance among employers, HSI has developed a plan to expand the Employee Compliance Inspection Center. The new center would allow for the centralization of worksite audits at one location that would ensure a standardized audit process and uniform application of the civil fine matrix. We believe that it would also represent an orderly and efficient way to build a culture of compliance with employers and at the same time identify the egregious violators on a national level for referral to the HSI field offices for criminal investigation. Without the proper resources dedicated to these criminal investigations, the ramifications of illegal activity will continue. To ensure enforcement efforts increase, ICE requests over $1.9 billion in discretionary fee funding to support illicit trade, travel, and financial investigations. As my partners have pointed out, our diverse workforce remains our priority to ensure that the mission is executed properly. HSI consists of more than 10,000 employees, of which 6,700 are special agents assigned to more than 200 cities throughout the United States and 50 countries around the world. Funding for additional special agents and support personnel is critical for global deployment to ensure the safety of our nation. We are extremely appreciative of the additional support that the subcommittee provided in the fiscal year 18 appropriation to invest in the ICE infrastructure. Critical investments in infrastructure and information technology continue to be necessary to sustain ICE operations and to ensure that we can provide our workforce with the necessary tools to complete the mission. HSI also continues to support the executive orders, laying the groundwork for ICE to carry out the critical work of ensuring our national security and public safety. HSI welcomes the additional resources requested in the President's fiscal year 19 budget request, including 300 special agents and supported mission support personnel, allowing us to better fulfill our mission. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear today and testify, and for your continued support of Homeland Security investigations. I look forward to answering any questions you may have at this time. Thank you.
All right, we're going to have a 5-minute rule, and I'm going to start off with something that is a very hot topic: border security and physical barriers. In FY17, Congress provided $20 million to begin planning it and design for new barrier, to include funds for prototypes, which were built in Southern California last year. We all saw them on television. What have you learned from the prototype process? How will it inform you what to construct in the FY19 funds? Congress provides funds for 40 miles of replacement fencing in 17, over 95 miles of wall and fencing in 18. Where and when will you begin construction with these funds? If FY19 budget includes $1.6 billion for planning, design, and construction of 65 miles of various type barriers, then tell us what your plans are for the border infrastructure. What type of structures do you propose with these funds, and where will they be located? From time to time you get funds. How long before you can start putting steel in the ground with the funds from FY19? Something of very big interest to me as a Texan. Walk us through the land acquisition process associated with the timeline, and what are the obstacles of obtaining land? Can the entire $1.6 billion be put on contract by September 30th, 2019? Please be specific to those projects that will be put on contract and address the situation in Texas where most land is owned by landowners, private landowners. A lot of issues there, but we've got to get a clear picture of, because we're on a short spending process here in this 18 budget, and we're still not doing 17 yet. So we want to find out how we're going to get this thing moving.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Important set of questions. First, let me just acknowledge our appreciation for the reprogramming approval in 17 to get started, to learn some additional lessons with this prototyping process that'll put us in good position for execution in 19, as you suggest. Very quickly, a summary of that effort. We had some important lessons learned. We built 4 concrete prototypes and 4 prototypes with other materials in a section of border in San Diego where we have a lot of crossings in that secondary area. After construction, we performed a test and evaluation, both for issues like countering breach of the barrier itself, anti-climb features, anti-dig features, as well as the construction techniques and space required. And so we learned several key things. One, we validated the notion that see-through fencing is the most important factor on primary for our agent safety. So if we're going to have a fence or a wall right on the border, our agents need to be able to see through it for security. Secondly, concrete has some valuable attributes that could be used in other areas, including potentially in a secondary context. So in terms of the key lessons from these 8 prototypes, one, we learned important things about the best combination of materials for anti-breach, both for the bollard wall format as well as the concrete. We applied anti-climb features in different configurations at the top of those barriers. You mentioned seeing some of them on TV. Both a flat face and the tube structure showed significant anti-climb capability for us. We learned a lot about the constructability and speed on the techniques, including the footing of concrete barrier and how much space is required, and the ability to add sensors. So we want to add these to our current border barrier toolkit, right? We have 654 miles out there already. We have a lot of experience over 25 years building barrier on the border. These features are going to be added to that design toolkit and then applied to specific geographic areas of the border with different terrain in packages by segment. In terms of your questions on 17, 18, and 19, we are building replacement wall as funded in 17 today. In El Centro sector, we started in February. That 2+ miles of replacement wall is going up in Southern California. We also kicked off Monday of this week our El Paso sector project with 20 miles of replacement vehicle barrier in terms of the construction. The notice to proceed was back in February. It required a significant mobilization given the extent of that project. We'll be continuing that replacement wall, those 40 miles that were funded in 17 in El Paso with another 4-mile segment. In Rio Grande Valley, importantly, with gates that will close gaps in the existing barrier and wall in Rio Grande Valley, and then a replacement project in the San Diego sector of 14 miles. All of that will begin by summer into early fall. So that funding has been obligated and will be applied effectively to start construction. For the 18 border wall program, we've jumped into that fully for the approximately 95 miles that we'll be building. That'll cover multiple sectors. First of all, our highest priority sector in Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. That's where the last several years we've seen 50% of traffic crossing our border. As alluded to in the opening statements, both an increase of family units and children, but also hard narcotics, a 25% increase in smuggling of hard narcotics, and also a significant increase in criminals and hardened smugglers that we're encountering. So it's a dual traffic there. So we'll be building 25 miles of new levee wall system and 8 miles of border wall system in Rio Grande Valley. And then we have a separate San Diego project of 14 miles of replacement wall and secondary. And then we've identified 4 or 5 sectors for replacement wall with the funding that was granted in the 2018 budget. We expect to do awards starting again this summer, August 23rd for the San Diego sector project, Rio Grande Valley in the August-September timeframe. So we'll be moving out smartly on those projects. We were preparing for that in anticipation of funding in 18. For 19, you asked specifically, would we be able to obligate those funds within the fiscal year if appropriated by Congress? And yes, we would. Our efforts with the Army Corps of Engineers to identify property acquisition in South Texas are well underway. The key thing, as you noted, is how do you work through that process of obtaining that property, private property in Texas on the border. In other states, it's a little bit different. That's a multi-stage process of real estate planning. You mentioned that we do have to go, unfortunately, to court proceedings in some cases. Often that's just to determine and clear title. It's not necessarily that we're having trouble agreeing with a landowner on a fair price for that property. So it's often just to find out who owns it. Some of these deeds go back to Spanish land grants and are very complex to really figure out who owns the land. So that's a multi-stage process. We try to do it in a collaborative and open consultative manner. We're able to reach appropriate price with most landowners, and then we do have to go through courts just to clear title in some other cases. But that's going to be underway with the $38 million authorized in 18 to do real estate planning in advance as well. So we'll be pursuing this effort. We've got a great partnership with the Army Corps of Engineers, great support from our leadership in the Department of Homeland Security, including in management and their procurement expertise, and we intend to do it right and expeditiously.
Okay, a couple of questions. Those gates. So do we still have we had an existing border wall, fairly substantial, but there were no gates. Have we got those gates in place now? Are they still gaps?
There are still gaps today. They're going to start going in place on October 5th, 2018. It's not a challenge of actually buying and installing the gates. Again, that's the property acquisition challenge, because once you have those gates in, you have to fully acquire all the land south of the levee wall to the border. But that's underway now. We're going to be getting installation in October of this year.
Well, one of our sales pitches we made to the landowners is the levee's going to protect you other property from flood, and with those holes in it, it's not. And we could have a lot of egg on our face, seeing as those have been up now for about 3 years, and we still have gigantic holes in it. Fortunately, we haven't, at least I'm not aware of a fact, that we've had any major flooding down there in that period of time. But we are in Hurricane Alley, and when those things come, we're going to be asking, you did all this construction, we all cooperated, why did our land flood? We don't want to be in that business. Planning wasn't done I've been warning people since day one. You're dealing with a different world in Texas than you're dealing with the rest of the world. It's all private property except the big men. And some of it you're right, goes back to the Spanish land grants, and I've had to pull those titles apart. Even in my part of the world, I used to try these dang things, and I hated them, by the way, but I did. And they can be really time-consuming. You're going to have to really get high behind, get a lot of lawyers working, or you're going to be forever on doing the Rio Grande Valley. Just a friendly warning. Because I tried way more of those than I ever want to try, and they're problems. All right, well, I've used up my time. Ms. Roble-Allard?
Associate Director Albence, it currently came to my attention that on August 29, 2017, ICE finalized a new directive on detention and removal of alien parents or legal guardians. This supersedes the August 23, 2013 directive on facilitating parental interest in the course of civil immigration enforcement activities. Just a month earlier, the House Appropriations Committee reported the fiscal year 2018 DHS Appropriations Act to the House, along with House Report 115-239, which included the following language. ICE should ensure that field officers are appropriately trained on the requirements of ICE's Parental Interest Directive and on mechanisms to reunite family units. ICE shall not rescind or change the policies contained in this directive. Well, it is true that the House report language was not legally binding. Can you explain to this committee the following? And I have three questions here. Why would ICE take this action just over a month after the committee made it clear its interest in the Parental Interest Directive? Second, why would ICE take the step without any kind of notification to the committee? And finally, can you describe the parts of the Parental Interest Directive that were eliminated in the new directive and explain why they were not included?
Thank you for your question. A lot of policies, obviously, when the executive orders were passed, required revision in order to align themselves with the requirements of the executive orders from the president. So we looked at all of our policies on a wholesale basis to determine which ones were in conflict with the executive orders and needed to be rewritten, which ones just needed some revisions, and other ones which needed to be done away with altogether. With regard to the Parental Interest Directive, what we found during the review was that there was a lot of information in there that was duplicative of information that was in other policies that could cause confusion among our officers out in the field that actually have to apply those policies. So what we were doing, in addition to looking at the policies and making sure they're consistent with the executive orders, is to also ensure that the guidance that we're able to give our employees is clear, concise, and it's able to be followed without confusion or conflict with other existing policies. So with regard to the policies, let me say what's the same in those policies. Both policies address the initial detention and placement of transfers. Both policies address the visitation requirements and the processes for that. Both address the coordinating the care of the minor children pending removal of the alien parent, and as well as the record-keeping requirements that are through this process. As always, the primary focus will be the safety and well-being of that child. One thing that we added in this policy, which was not there previously, which we think is important, is how do we handle children and others that we come across during enforcement actions on the interior of the United States. When we arrest a parent taking an enforcement action, how do we handle those children that may not have an appropriate parent or guardian that's able to be remaining at that residence to take care of those child? So we work very closely, and it lays out in that policy the directions that their officers must take to establish alternate accommodations for that child, generally with family members, friends, somebody the parent, and the parent is involved in that process, is telling the officers who they want their children to go with. Only as a last resort will we have to go to something like a Department of Children and Family Services when there is no adult that the parent is comfortable with and that we are comfortable with from a safety perspective to place that child. Again, the Immigration and Nationality Act clearly recognizes the heightened role of the parent and the responsibilities and sensitivities surrounding that, which is why the INA provides provisions for relief from removal for individuals that are parents. So an immigration judge can find and can't issue a cancellation of removal on an alien parent in removal proceedings, even if that individual has been found removable to be violation of immigration laws. So we certainly, throughout the immigration enforcement continuum, understand and respect the parental rights. We have policies, and this policy in particular, we allow parents that have been removed, if they need to be paroled back into the United States, who attend a court hearing with regard to custody or other child welfare issues. Our parole policy already covers how that's done. So that was in the old policy. It specifically laid out what was done. It was duplicative of what's in our existing parole policy. So in order to streamline things and make it more user-friendly for our officers, that part was taken out. It didn't take away their right to have parole or their ability to have parole to come in for one of these hearings. It's just covered by another policy, so it was duplicative in this policy.
Let me just suggest that perhaps in the future, when a decision is being made, even if it's a directive from the president, and it is not consistent with language and directives from the committee, that I would recommend that you at least contact the chairman of the committee and inform them that of decisions that are being made that do not reflect what has been put into report language. And just very quickly, as a follow-up to what you were mentioning with regards to the children, there have been several stories in the press lately about the separation of families by both CBP and ICE. And I asked Secretary Nielsen about this during yesterday's hearing, and I want to raise it again here today. I understand that one reason for separating minor children from a parent or guardian is the concern about the validity of a claim familial relationship that traffickers may use to enter this country. What I'd like to know is a little bit more about what is the process for verifying familial relations or debunking these concerns, and what are the weaknesses in the process that have caused unjustified separations of parents from their children, as was the case with the Congolese mother that was separated from her 7-year-old child for 4 months. One was, I believe the mother was sent to like San Diego, and the 7-year-old child was sent to Chicago. And that it would be both for you, Commissioner, and for Mr. Albens.
I can start, Matt. Thank you, Ranking Member. First of all, for CBP, a separation of a group that presents as a family unit is right now a very rare event. It's about 1.4% of all of these groups that show up at our border. And the first question you asked is, how do you determine family relationship? So this is done very, very carefully based on an interview of the individuals, based on processing with fingerprints, looking at records in our system, coordination with the consulate, coordination with other authorities in the United States. So when we make a determination to separate a family based on the fact that we don't believe there's a familial relationship, it's generally based on admitted or clear fraud for some of a CBP perspective. The other cases where there's separation when it is a family unit is if there is a criminal issue with the adult parent that needs to go through the DOJ process and for prosecution. And that's, again, a very rare circumstance. So we have careful policies, supervisory approval, and it doesn't happen very often.
Now, I know I've run out of time, so I'm really more interested in understanding better what are the weaknesses in the process that would cause cases, because this isn't the only case we've heard of this Congolese mother being separated, where in fact at the end she was finally given a DNA test 4 months later. What can be done to better ensure that these things do not happen? Because one of the big concerns is that psychiatrists and psychologists tell us, and experts in this field tell us, that the trauma that is caused to the child is very often not reversible. And so that is my concern, is what can be done to help ensure that these things don't happen at the offset.
Thank you. We obviously share your concerns. Our concern always is the health and well-being of that child, especially when they're in a position where they themselves did not choose to make that journey. One of the difficulties that we experience, and commissioners, officers experience it, but it also comes on us, is that individuals don't have any documentation. They've managed to travel around the world with documentation, but by the time they come to us, that documentation has disappeared or has been thrown away or not used. So there's always concerns that somebody is trying to obfuscate their relationship or their identity when they appear without immigration, with any sort of identification documents, which is why we work very, very closely with the consular officers. Without getting into any one case in particular, a lot of that hinges upon the cooperation with the consular officers. If we have an individual that presents themselves as a parent and there's questions with regard to that relationship, and they refuse to speak to a consular officer from their home country for an extended period of time, it makes things difficult for us. Not only that, it raises a red flag. If this individual is genuinely this individual's parent, why would they not be taking every affirmative step to make sure that they could be reunited with that individual? So, unfortunately, it is a balancing act sometimes where we have to err on the side of the safety of that child. God forbid we put them in the hands of a trafficker or somebody that is not their parent, and they become victimized from that. That said, we are always looking at our policies and our procedures to ensure that they are as efficient and as effective as possible. You mentioned DNA. That's something that we're looking at from a DHSY perspective as to how we can better utilize DNA in this process, as well as our other enforcement processes that we have. And we'd be glad to come back and give you a full briefing on that at another time. Absolutely. Great. Thank you.
Mr. Harris, Dr. Harris.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of you for the job you do enforcing the law. My first question to the Commissioner and to Mr. Albans, your agents are sworn law enforcement agents, is that right? They are. So they believe, as every law enforcement officer I've ever talked with, they do believe they exist to make America safe, to make communities safe. I imagine that's the way they feel. So I'm going to apologize for the left-wing attacks that your officers had today on them. You heard today that somehow their law enforcement efforts make communities less safe. And I've got to tell you, that kind of attacks on American law enforcement agents and officers has to stop, because it doesn't lead to good things, as we're experiencing in Maryland, where, of course, some of our police officers have come under attack, and where we now have record murder rates in one of our cities, because, honestly, law enforcement officers get discouraged when that's what they hear from public officials. So I'm going to apologize to that. Because what's really heartless would be letting MS-13 terrorize Maryland communities. To my surprise, MS-13, Maryland is the second most common active place for MS-13. Literally within 30 miles of where we sit today, MS-13 runs rampant because we have not enforced our immigration laws in the past. Now, Commissioner, we heard there's no need for increased border funding because border crossings border crossings are down, but in fact, or historic lows. I think that's what we heard today, historic lows. But actually, I think the border crossing in the past, in February and March, actually were higher than in 2 of the last 6 years. I think that we're actually seeing an increase in border crossings above levels that we've seen in the past decade. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. So, in fact, we're not at historic low border crossings. We're actually seeing a resurgence in border crossing, which I believe is because we're talking about amnesty once again. And believe me, look, I understand the economics of it. If America has open borders, you freely cross, you come here, you get citizenship, why wouldn't you cross our borders? So I personally feel that we not only need the $1.6 billion in that budget, we needed far more to do it, including a wall. Now, Mr. Albans, your agents don't remove people who are here illegally, do they, unless they have committed a crime? Is that right? I mean, you don't go find people here legally and remove them. I mean, my family is here legally. I don't think you come knocking on our doors to remove us, do you?
Correct. Our officers.
Okay. That's what I thought. I mean, look, these are simple questions. The fact of the matter is, your law enforcement officers enforce the law. Now, people may disagree on what the law ought to be. That's fine. We live in a democracy. We disagree. We just go ahead and we make changes to the law if we need to. But we have to trust our law enforcement officers and support them when they enforce the law. Now, we heard about an impulsive decision on calling out the National Guard. The last president also called them out, but I don't recall the word impulsive being used then, because impulsive, honestly, is a personal attack on our president. I get it. I fully get it. It doesn't belong in the national conversation. It doesn't do anything for us. Mr. Albans, do sanctuary policies which let local jurisdictions release prisoners knowing there are detainers? I've read that could threaten the safety of your agents, because now your agents have to go out and instead of taking them into custody in a jail, which is a safe environment, they have to go into the community. Is that correct? Is that the impression of your officers?
Yes, it endangers the safety of our officers, and it especially endangers the safety of the communities in which they're being released back into.
So talk about trauma, I mean, and talk about trauma and who elicits trauma. I mean, my understanding is there was a dreamer called Ivan Castaneda in Colorado last month, killed a 57-year-old. Now, that's real trauma. Then gets held in a Denver prison, and they don't contact ICE, and they release him into the community. That's the potential for trauma. Mr. Benner, did I hear you right that you've seized 2,000 pounds of fentanyl last year?
Yes, that's correct.
2,000 pounds. Now, I'm an anesthesiologist. I know what fentanyl is, and I used it in the operating room last week. Most people don't realize that 1/4 of a milligram can kill you if it's injected IV, a minuscule amount. And I just did the calculation. I want to thank your agency for doing this, because that amount of fentanyl, given as an intravenous bolus incorrectly, can kill 4 billion people. That's the amount of fentanyl we're talking about that potentially crosses our borders, and you are the thin blue line that helps separate us from that. Literally, you've seized enough to kill 4 billion. This has got to end, and one of the ways it ends is through law enforcement. I just want to end by saying, look, thank you all for enforcing the law, and in the instance of seizing dangerous drugs like fentanyl and finding where they're coming from, saving potentially thousands of American lives. So thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Mr. Cuellar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One good thing about this committee, we do have different perspectives. I think we're all trying to reach the same thing, but we do look at things a little differently. For example, when we talk about crime, everybody points out to the border. But I think if you look at the latest FBI statistics, the crime level at the border is lower than the national crime rate. I don't have the exact number of Mr. Harris, but I can bet you that my city of Laredo has less murders per 100,000, less rapes per 100,000, less assaults per 100,000. In fact, if you look at Laredo compared to the Washington, D.C., the murder rate is much higher here than we have, and I think lately we've had more people jump the White House fence than some of the other fences that we have down there. So we do have different perspectives, and I appreciate that we're looking at, but you just can't blame the whole fault on the border itself. And that's the point that we want to make sure that we understand. And I appreciate everything that y'all do. I've been very supportive of the work that ICE does. And please say hello to Tom for me. Commissioner, again, congratulations on your appointment. But we do disagree to a couple things. Happy that we got another, I think, 28 CBP officers, and hopefully you put them in the areas that we need them, the high traffic areas that we need them. If we're trying to stop drugs, understand that according to DEA, most of the drugs come through ports of entry. So the monies that we added for technology will be good for ports. The new CBP officers will be good, so we can stop the drugs coming in. They don't come in between the ports of entry. I mean, the majority of them will come through the ports of entry, and we need to make sure we stop them at other places. If we want to stop people from coming in, keep in mind that over 40% of the people that came in came through legal visas. So even if you put the highest wall or fence, they're either going to drive through a port, they're going to fly on an airplane, or they're going to come in by ship. So again, we have to look at this comprehensively and not think that the wall, which is a 14th century solution, is the solution, the magical bullet to everything that we're looking at. The reason I'm against the wall is, one, the cost. It's expensive. 1 mile of technology compared to 1 mile of fencing is a big difference. Maybe $1 million to now, it used to be $6.5 million per mile of fencing. Now it's a lot more, depending on what prototype you want to follow. Private property rights, I'm amazed how some of our friends have fought for private property rights, but it comes to the border, it's a different double standards itself. So I'm a big believer on standard rights, on the private property rights. If you look at the terrain, we know, and I think all of you have been down to the border, it's hard. And sometimes you have to put a fence or a wall a mile away from the bank because of the terrain, the International Boundary Water Commission standards. So you give away that. People have talked about the gates. What are you going to do about cattle and wildlife? Are you going to give them automatic gate openers so they can go ahead and open the gates itself? So there's a lot of issues we have to look at. But I think one of the most important things that we have to look at is what the Border Patrol chief has said. Bush, different chiefs under him, Obama, and even under the current one, under Trump. How much time does the fence actually buy you? Quote, the last Trump, or the Border Patrol chief under Trump said, quote, a few minutes or a few seconds. Quote, And again, I rather have an awareness where you can have the aerostats, cameras, sensors, enough Border Patrol. And as you know, Commissioner, we're actually losing more Border Patrol than we're hiring Border Patrol. We just put out a $296 million contract. I wish we would have used that to give our men and women a bonus or retention instead of losing our men and women that we're losing right now. So again, we're all trying to do the right thing. We just have different perspectives. And again, I don't want to get political, but November, we might have a different perspective after the November elections. We just don't know. So I just want you all to be flexible. And when you talk about those 8 miles in Stark County, my district, or you talk about the levee wall, and the levee wall is one of the issues that Senator Cornyn and myself and the district county judge, county judge, we came up with that compromise under the Bush administration. The only thing I would ask you is take local input in consideration. I know we did the wildlife exemption. There's still a Benson Park that we like to look at. I mean, I'm just saying, let's just take the local input, because the last time Washington came down marching through a wall back under the Bush administration, they were looking at cutting the UT Brownsville University in half. My joke was, are you going to take English and Spanish or in English, depending on where your classroom was at? So we just have to be a little bit considerate of the local population input as we put some of this security. Again, I've always said I support security. I got a border sheriff who's my brother down there in Webb County. I appreciate the Hector Garces and the Cabreras and David Higgersons, Jason, Mr. Owens down there, Manny Padilla. You got a lot of good people. Janice Alaya, you got a lot of good people. All I'm saying is you got to take some of our communities in consideration as you do this. We just can't have Washington, big government, come down and say, we know Stark County better than we do. We know this better than we do. Just take the local communities in consideration. I'll come back on the second line of rounding.
Giving you more time, Mr. Quayle, but you never ask a question.
Yes, sir. Okay. Well, Mr. Harris got
But you preached a good sermon while you were at it. No, you did.
Harris has a way of getting people excited.
He's a good guy. Who's next? Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll try not to make that mistake. But thank you for having this hearing, both you and the ranking member. Gentlemen, thank you for being here with us this morning. I got to say that you are tasked with one of the most difficult and most important jobs that we have in this country, keeping our homeland safe. And just appreciate very much all of the efforts that you and the people that you represent that stand behind you make on our behalf. So thank you from the American people. Director Albans, I represent the state of Washington, part of the state of Washington in the central part of the state, which is a rich agricultural region. Agriculture is the biggest economic driver in my district. We pride ourselves in the number of different crops we raise, the variety of different things that we raise. Just in the last couple of weeks, I held a farm bill listening tour. Tried to touch base with as many of my producers as I could in every single county. And the conversation quickly went to probably one of the issues that are top of their mind. It has to do with our labor force and the severe crisis that it's in. One of the solutions that has been is to utilize the H-2A program, the Agricultural Guest Worker Program. And just the last couple of years, H-2A workers, not just in my state, but throughout the country, are record numbers. I think the numbers are nearly quadrupled. I think we're bringing in something this year over 30,000 just in the state of Washington alone. But it's still, interesting, not enough to meet the needs of the agricultural economy. So let me just relate to you some of the things that my producers are telling me. Because of the broadening enforcement efforts by ICE, targeting, the word used many times, even legal workers and illegal farmers, it comes to people are in a place where they think they are being targeted. And I've continued to work with my colleagues in the House of Representatives and the Senate to try to find solutions to our immigration issues. That's on us. And we fully accept that responsibility. We continue to work with the administration and others to fix that. But like I said, growers in my district as well as around the country have said that even with a legal workforce, they're feeling that they are being unfairly targeted and become ground zero for ICE raids because of their workforce, which makes it tougher to grow the food and fiber that we need. So with that premise, the continued targeting of agriculture, it's not going to fix a system that's broken. It's become which has truly become a bureaucratic nightmare. It's not going to address the needs in farm country. You know, if you add in enforcement actions to existing delays in the H-2A program, which is outdated and bureaucratic, along with food and labor shortages already, just more problems are added onto an already dire situation. Many in ag see that ICE is looking for a pretext by targeting agriculture, and that, true or not, I want to express that to you. We can't see another year of crops going unpicked. It's costing agriculture millions and millions of dollars around the country. Now, I fully appreciate the work that you do, and I listened intently to the comments that you made as far as your mission. In fact, I read with great interest the mission statement that's in your biography to identify, arrest, remove aliens who present a danger to national security or a risk to public safety, and I applaud that, and we want to give you every single resource that we can to make sure that you can fulfill your duty and your mission. But we have scarce resources. Could you explain to us what your priority is, and help me understand the dynamic here, the feeling in ag country versus your stated mission of finding those that are a threat to national security and a risk to public safety? Could you talk to me about that and maybe your view? Is the administration's enforcement policies, are we fighting against ourselves when we don't have a comprehensive immigration reform system?
I'll briefly answer your question, then I'll pass it over to Mr. Benner here because he controls worksite enforcement, and I think that's kind of where you were going with that. I will tell you from an ERO perspective, we do targeted enforcement operations. We don't do raids. The individuals that when we go out to make an arrest, we know who we're going to arrest. We know where we expect them to be, and we also, when we have the available intelligence, also know who else might be there with them. So we exercise all due diligence to ensure that if we're going after an aggravated felon, somebody's got a weapons violation or an aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, or it's a pedophile, that we make sure that the other individuals that might be present in that residence are not also posing a risk for the safety of our officers as well as the community. So we don't engage in raids. We do targeted enforcement operations. As I mentioned the statistics in my opening, and we can certainly provide you more.
Yes, 74% have criminal records.
74%, no, 89% have criminal records. 74% are actually convicted.
Very good.
And then absent those that are criminals, the other largest bucket of the individuals that we arrest are individuals that are fugitives, meaning they've been through the immigration court process, have had their day in court, have availed themselves of any appellate process they may choose to do so, but at the end of that process, they've been ordered removed by an immigration judge. We're going to have to execute that removal order. And then those who have actually been removed and then illegally re-enter the country, which again is a federal felony, one that we prosecute significantly, and Commissioner McLean's people prosecute that case heavily along the border as well. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll pass it over to Mr. Benner to talk about worksite.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the question. I want to be kind of clear in terms of the fiscal year 18 priorities and the worksite efforts that we've had this year, and we've said clearly that that no industry is off the table by itself. And as a matter of fact, the surge operations that we've done in 18 have not included the agriculture industry at all. We've actually been looking at in Operation Backtrack. We've been looking at previous audits where we've had some significant findings at that time. So we're looking to make sure that there's not a kind of a culture of illicit employment occurring again. We've looked at, in particular, some of the building and trade industry of the smaller level in communities. One of our goals in talking about this compliance center, this centralized center, is to bring a sense of orderliness and efficiency to the audit process and centralize it for the whole country so that we're actually able to create more of a culture of compliance through audits and fines as opposed to enforcement action. And what we want to do is have a regularized, reasonable expectation, similar to the IRS, that people, business owners, could feel that we're going to look at their I-9 eligibility documents and we're going to audit them. And then from that, at the national level, we'll be able to distill the actual most egregious violators on a national level and not on a town by town or county by county or industry by industry. We can actually look at the national level, like, who are the worst? Because one of the top priorities for us when it comes to criminal investigations is the exploitation of unauthorized workers.
So you're talking about worst employers versus employees, right?
The worst employers that have built a business model on unauthorized workers. And typically, I'll tell you my experience is in many criminal investigations with these types of employers, the unauthorized workers are exploited in terrible ways. Wage earnings, safety, improper training, improper equipment. They're treated completely differently than the authorized workers in all of those areas. And many of them will not come forward to report unsafe working conditions or injuries because there would be the fear of being let go and terminated. So that's one of the top priorities for HSI is the exploitation. I also want to remind, we have to remind ourselves, I think, too, is when we talk about worksite, is the collateral crimes that occur around an illicit employment scheme. Tax fraud, identity theft, bank fraud, the exploitation crimes that I just mentioned, the OSHA violations in terms of unsafe working conditions for employees, and the illicit payment methods that the most egregious employers use to pay the unauthorized workforce in cash. So our goal is to having 10 years of experience kind of in the worksite realm. Our goal is to take that work out of the field offices, create a centralized process that uses smart automation and uses auditors to execute that audit function on a national level and a risk-based model.
All right. Thank you very much. And I've gone way over my time. I apologize for that, Mr. Chairman, but thank you for your answers.
Mr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me add my welcome to all of you. Thank you for appearing before the subcommittee. I want to pick up on Mr. Newhouse's line of questioning, actually, and maybe put it in a broader context. I've been on this subcommittee a long time. I've worked with Mr. McAleenan and other career employees for many years, been chairman, been ranking member, and so I'm very familiar with this debate about enforcement priorities. So I'm going to turn to you, Mr. Albence, and ask you to hopefully help me understand what's going on. I have supported efforts like the Priority Enforcement Program in the last administration, the idea being to prioritize the enforcement efforts on dangerous people. It's very straightforward and very simple. The best way to utilize limited law enforcement resources is to prioritize those who truly provide a threat to public safety and national security. Now, this isn't providing anybody a free pass, but it does assume that discretion must be exercised, will be exercised by enforcement authorities. Now, President Trump has claimed that he focuses on dangerous criminals. In fact, sometimes he seems to regard most immigrants as dangerous criminals, but he's made that claim. But it seems to me his enforcement efforts have been unfocused and sometimes arbitrary. And I'll just give you a quick example. Inexplicable decisions regarding constituents that have little to do with any understandable exercise of discretion. I just have to say, in January, for example, during a regularly scheduled check-in with ICE officials in Atlanta, one of my constituents was arrested. He'd been in the U.S. for 14 years, had built a life in North Carolina, a prominent member of a local church, living with HIV, chronic kidney failure, and diabetes. His only crime was overstaying his visa because he had a credible fear of political retaliation in returning to his home country. He checked in regularly with ICE for over 8 years under his order of supervision, was still fighting to receive asylum, but when he went to his appointment in January, he was arrested, and now he has been shipped out. He was an upstanding member of the community. Now he's been deported. The specific combination of medicine that he needs to fight his HIV, his diabetes, his chronic kidney disease is not available, I promise you, in his country of birth. I have said this to, I contacted the department and talked to someone supposedly in a position to do something about this. I fear ICE gave him a death sentence. And that was very clear at the time, I assure you. It's not something I'm saying in retrospect. This is just one example. I can promise you that nearly all of my 534 colleagues could give you similar stories. Now, let's talk about discretion, even at an accelerated rate. Deportations are only a fraction of millions of immigrants here illegally. There will always be that situation. Therefore, there is always going to be discretion required in terms of immigration priorities. The President has said there will be priorities. Yet, sometimes Director Holman talks as though there's no alternative, no discretion. He once said he's simply following the law. We've all been around long enough to know that that is simply not the situation. There must be discretion. You're always going to be shipping out only a fraction of those who are here illegally. So the question is, what kind of discretion are we using? On what principle, on what basis are we doing this? I want to know that. I think we're entitled to know it. Isn't it true that discretion is inevitable? And what can you tell us about your current grading criteria in the administrative exercise of discretion? What is your order of removal strategy?
Thank you for your question, and I appreciate the opportunity to get some facts out there about how we actually do our business, because I think there's a lot of misconception, both in, especially in the press. There's a lot of sensationalization about what we do and how we do it.
Let me just assure you, I'm not relying on press accounts. I'm relying on firsthand experience. I'm relying on an attempt to work with your agency in getting facts brought to attention that I thought warranted attention. So press accounts, whatever they may be, that's not what we're talking about here.
With regard to how we conduct our operations, as I've mentioned, and as we do targeted enforcement operations. That does not mean that those individuals that are here unlawfully in the country that are either encountered during the course of those operations or at some point in the past were encountered at the border and placed into removal proceedings are not going to have the law enforced equitably against them. In order to establish fidelity to the immigration system, there has to be a consequence at the end. When an individual goes through the immigration court process, and if he goes through and if the individual claims credible fear, that's just the first step. They go in front of an immigration judge to make a determination as to whether or not an asylum is going to be granted. If the judge grants that asylum, that individual goes and gets their benefit and is never bothered by ICE again unless they commit some sort of criminal activity because they're here lawfully. We respect the decision of the judge in those cases. If that individual is denied asylum and ordered removed by an immigration judge, we also respect that decision. We have to be equitable in the way we do our business. So if we're going to respect the decision when an immigration judge finds in the favor of the alien, we also have to respect the decision when the immigration finds in favor of the government when we prosecute that case. And if we don't execute that order at the end of that process, then we don't have a process.
All right, there are 11 million people for whom who are vulnerable in the respect you're describing. Are you or are you not exercising discretion in choosing whom to detain, whom to deport in that large universe of people? Are you, in fact, prioritizing dangerous people? You claim to be doing that, but then turn around and also claim that you have no discretion.
We are certainly prioritizing individuals that are national security and public safety threats, repeat immigration violators, and immigration fugitives. But we are not doing so at the sole exclusion of other immigration violators. We are not going to turn a blind eye to somebody that we end up in contact with that has violated the immigration laws. Most of these individuals in these cases that have been here for a long time were arrested entering the country illegally in the first place. That's how they ended up in the immigration continuum. So we are just merely following through on the processes that has been established. And when the process is that an individual receives a removal order and we're required to execute it, we will do so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, is it Palacio? Oh, Fleshman, I'm sorry. Mr. Fleshman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, gentlemen. I have a two-part question. Yesterday, I asked Secretary Nielsen about the challenges fentanyl and other synthetic opioids are presenting to this country. First off, I would like to ask you, Commissioner McAleenan, how you are planning to utilize the $224 million for opioid and non-intrusive inspection equipment. Specifically, what investments in technology are you wanting to prioritize? For Director Benner, I know Homeland Security investigations has played an integral role in current interagency efforts for disrupting and dismantling TCOs. Our intelligence and situation awareness for cocaine is impressive. Our efforts as mature when it comes to the organizations involved in opioid smuggling, and where do further investments need to be made? Gentlemen, I'll ask for the most concise answers because I have two other questions.
We have a robust, multifaceted effort against fentanyl, but I'll focus on your question given the time. We really appreciate the boost in funding for non-intrusive inspection technology. Fentanyl is coming through ports of entry on our land border, as well as through international mail and express consignment facilities. So we'll be applying this funding on two types of technology. One, increasing our ability to detect it, especially in vehicles or in small packages. We want to increase the amount of vehicles that we're sending through inspection and increase the fidelity with which we can detect concealed narcotics in those vehicles, as well as small packages. The second side is the testing. The good doctor alluded to the high potency and risk of fentanyl. We want to be able to test it carefully to protect our officers, but also as soon as we find out what it is, prioritizing those for controlled delivery with our investigative partners at HSI, U.S. Postal Inspection Service, and state and local so that we can arrest the people on the U.S. side receiving those dangerous drugs and take effective criminal arrest and prosecution action.
Thank you, sir. Director Benner.
Thank you for the question, sir. We're grateful for the resources, the special agent resources that we got in fiscal year 18 as an addition. And I can tell you that those resources are going directly towards the fight in fentanyl. And for example, we're in certain parts of the country where we have the Border Enforcement Security Task Force in partnership with the Commissioner's team, Ohio Border Enforcement Security Task Force and the one in Memphis at the mail hub. We're in lockstep with CBP in terms of the interdiction piece and then taking that next step, the investigation piece, to identify the illicit supply chain and actually the other bad actors that are out there. And some of the investigative techniques we use lead us to additional criminal activity, and in certain cases, I'm thinking of a case in Pennsylvania, one of the largest pill mill manufacturing operations in the state's history of synthetic drugs, of which the very pure, high purity levels of fentanyl coming from China is an ingredient. And I can assure you these aren't chemists that are making these pills there. The scariest part about this is, so we fight it on the border front, but we also fight it on the dark web and the illicit marketplaces. And the scariest part about this issue is you don't need to know a drug dealer anymore. You can sit in your home at a computer, download the Onion router, get on the illicit marketplace, order these substances, pay for it using cryptocurrency or other forms of money service businesses and transfers, have it shipped to a P.O. box or an address, and wait for it to show up. The days of knowing a drug dealer on the street and conducting hand-to-hand deals, unfortunately, that's not prevalent in fentanyl. And so we have to be laser-focused on the cyber aspect as much as we do the border aspect. And I can tell you that based on our resource prioritization model, for fiscal year 19, we plan on dedicating, if the committee sees fit, a substantial number of those 300 special agents to the fentanyl fight and the MS-13 fight.
Thank you. Well, it looks like, Mr. Chairman, my time is about up. I had a couple other questions, but I will pass. Thank you.
Mr. Ruppersberger,
Are we having a second round, Mr. Chairman?
I hope to.
Okay. Well, first thing, I want to make a statement first. This is not going to be a question. And I think it's relevant because it's an issue now that the President has ordered a certain amount of National Guards to go to the border. I've been working in national security now in Congress the last 15 years. And in my opinion, that is not, it's a waste of money or for the National Guard to go to the border. And they're going to be just backup. That is not really where the issues are. Of course, we need enforcement, we need Border Patrol, and I believe very strongly that securing our borders should be a top priority. As a matter of national security, we should know who is coming in our country and who is not. But just as important as who, we need to know what is coming in, to our country. As you know, Customs and Border Patrol, Border Protection plays the lead role in stopping the importation of contraband, such as prescription painkillers, opiate analogs. These drugs are pervasive in all of our districts. I want to share with everyone on the committee and to you all, and you know these numbers, I'm sure, how much worse the problem is getting. In 2013, Customs and Border Patrol seized 2.4 pounds of fentanyl. That is 2.4 pounds, whatever. In contrast, just last year, CBP diverted over 71,000 pounds throughout the country from the black market. And for this reason, our priorities in this budget should be in stemming the flow of illegal narcotics, especially fentanyl. Dr. Harris stated how serious it is. It's, as we know, it can touch your skin and affect you. Very serious, and especially as it relates to our agents. It's 10 times more potent than heroin, so it's something we have to deal with. My question, I'll get to the more specifics the second round if we have it, Mr. McClellan. And by the way, you've had a great future so far, and I'm glad you're in your position. And you all have tough jobs. You've got, when you made the comment about you have to follow the order of the judge, that's very important and relevant. But we have a lot of issues here with 11 million people. And what Congressman Price was saying was very important. But you have certain jobs, and we understand that. But we also ask for discretion and training to deal with the issue. First, my question is simple in this one, and then I'll get to the facts later. What steps is DHS taking to stop the importation of highly potent, highly concentrated fentanyl?
Thank you, Congressman, for an opportunity to elaborate on our strategy. At CBP, I commissioned a counter-opioid strategy early last year to really make our efforts more comprehensive and integrated across the agency. And so we're pursuing this along multiple lines. The first, I mentioned the two vectors for fentanyl, the land border ports of entry and the international mail and express consignment facilities. On the mail side, that growth has been explosive with e-commerce, five-fold increase in the last 6 years in international mail facilities. That means at JFK we could get 1 million parcels a day coming in through that mail facility. So the first thing we need to start with as we do all of our enforcement and risk management at CBP is good data, good information on what's in those shipments. So we've been partnering with the U.S. Postal Service to increase the amount of information on mail parcels coming into the U.S. And I'm talking about from under 10% a year and a half ago to 65+% now, thanks to U.S. Postal Service engagement with China in particular, which is the primary source of fentanyl, and we're putting that to good use. We've already tripled our fentanyl seizures in the mail environment in this fiscal year from last year, and that's based primarily on these targeted efforts with good data coming in. I mentioned in the response to the last question, the technology, being able to inspect it and test it better, and then partner with our investigative partners to actually do that controlled delivery, to understand who is receiving it, and then target the network and see what else they're trying to order from abroad. So we're trying to hit it from all of those angles. The information up front, the analysis of what's coming in, good technology to inspect an increased number of vehicles and shipments, and then good partnership with investigators.
You know, we know the President has made it a campaign promise of securing the wall, but we also, and I think Congress understood it, so they didn't get the money needed, that it's more important to have technology working with the wall and the manpower to deal with it. Now, I only have like 20 seconds, so I'm not going to get too far into this. But, you know, I started out by talking about having the National Guard for whatever reason, you know, and all the support that they're just going to be support. Would it be better to have more DEA agents, since really drugs and fentanyl now and the problem of opioids is where we are, than it would be to have more National Guard? Or would you rather not comment on that?
I think both investigative partners and extending our capability with increased surveillance by the National Guard is important. HSI is our primary partner for drug investigations on seizures at the border. DEA is a tremendous partner for us as well. But what the National Guard is going to do is bring in significant aviation assets that can close our gap for that surveillance piece at the immediate border. It is supportive, but it also tells us what's crossing so that we can interdict it more effectively.
I just came from another hearing where we had the head of the National Guard and asked what the duties were going to be. It seemed to me that they're more administrative or support than anything. But my time, is my time up, or do I have 30 seconds? I'm over. All right, I yield back. I'll get into more detail in the second round.
Mr. Palacio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. Border security is absolutely national security. Thank you for protecting America, trying to keep our community safe, trying to stop the flow of the drugs, the human trafficking, the gun trafficking, the foreign nationals from coming into our country. And so thank you. Thank you for doing your duty. The majority of the American people appreciate you following the rule of law and trying to protect our communities, states, and our nation. You know, I had another question. I hope I get to it. I'm a member of the Mississippi National Guard. I'm chairman of the National Guard caucus, and I think the National Guard, like as you mentioned, is going to be a huge multiplying force for your agency and for securing the border. You know, our national defense, our active duty military could not do anything without our Guard and reserves. I mean, they can, but to sustain operations, and so they're great for plug and play. So be creative on how you use them. Don't just have them guarding fences, doing fire watch and things of that nature. I participated in joint task force missions on the border in the 90s, doing just surveillance. Communications, using our eyes and our ears and our brains and reporting back, and so feeding you the data to hopefully make intel out of it. So with that, I'd like to jump into some quick questions. CBP has two key missions: securing the border and facilitating cross-border commerce that powers the nation's economic growth. And U.S. CBP officers are the most important border security and trade facilitation resources we have. However, to accomplish their mission, CBP needs enough agents and officers to be able to screen cargo, interdict illegal drugs and contraband, and make arrests while moving legitimate commerce and passengers through our air, land, rail, and seaports of entry. We have sat through many of these hearings together, and we know for a variety of reasons that the CBP officers are in short supply these days, which has created a national security and economic vulnerability that this Congress must address. CBP is critically understaffed and remains well below its congressionally mandated staffing levels by about 1,000 CBP officers and nearly 2,000 Border Patrol agents. So I'm curious if you've given any thought to potentially leveraging the private sector to alleviate some of the manpower shortages by allowing qualified private sector security screening experts to carry out day-to-day scanning and screening functions and image analysis, which would free up your officers to concentrate on their law enforcement and oversight missions. And I'll leave that open to whoever wants to answer.
I'll specifically answer that question, and obviously happy to talk about many aspects of our hiring effort to get the right workforce out there. We have made progress. Last year we hired almost 200 additional CBP officers, and we expect to increase our performance this year through a number of efforts. But in terms of your specific question, how are we leveraging private sector assets for functions like effectively reviewing scans from non-intrusive inspection technology? We're actually leveraging the private sector heavily in this area. both to provide an ability to do an automated analysis of the vast majority of scans. That capability is increasing due to artificial intelligence techniques. But we've also been able to partner with industry, and we're currently rolling out an integrated viewer that can combine images from a variety of different technologies produced by different manufacturers and present a consistent picture for our officers and analysts. You're right, it doesn't have to be an officer or an agent to review that technology. It could be an expert hired for that specific purpose or contracted out in some cases to do a good analysis of that image. That is absolutely something we're pursuing. And we're going to have, if we have the appropriate specialties in our National Guard partners, we've requested support in some of those areas to help extend our capabilities as well.
Well, I mentioned to the Secretary of Homeland Security yesterday that DHS actually has a research and experimental UAV facility at Camp Shelby, which is our nation's largest National Guard training site in America. And so, you know, this is one fight. Multiple agencies are going to be participating. Y'all are obviously the lead agency, but, you know, we got the Coast Guard in South and Central America trying to interdict drugs and bad actors before they make it into Mexico and to the drug and whatever, the highway that will, you know, because if it's still correct, I mean, if it makes it into Mexico, it's going to make it into America. I mean, it's just the resources that they have are huge. And I'm just glad this president, this Congress, and the American people are supporting us and investing in your agency, invested in your resources, which are your people and the equipment that you need to do your job and to be successful. The American people are with you. Good luck, and just let us know how we can continue to help you do your job. Thank you.
Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the three of you. Appreciate you being here. Appreciate what you're doing for the nation, and please give our best to the men and women who work under you that are out there every single day for us. So thank you. I want to focus in on the dark web really quickly. You know, with Tor servers and things like that of that nature. Of course, how are you in terms of resources and personnel and technology and training to be able to combat illicit sales on the dark web? Are you hiring graduates to the HERO program to supplement the cyber workforce? And are you piggybacking and partnering with other agencies that may have better expertise in that regard?
Absolutely. We're very proud of the HERO program. We've offered positions to over 100 of the graduates of the HERO program. We have 2 classes that we'll be executing on in 18. And we thank the committee for the 10 positions, additional positions that we received to place the HEROs into full-time positions. Here's the challenge. These are some of our best and most passionate mission executors that we have in HSI. And it's my belief that working in the child exploitation field is not something that we should expect them to do for a long period of time. We need to develop a career path for them to serve in that cyber world in another function. So what we would propose and what we would like to work with the committee on is positions such as a cyber investigator or a cyber intelligence analyst to continue to use the training that they have, which is up here. I mean, they're certified forensic agents at that point, and to give them the career path to continue to serve in areas of high priority, which is there's really no other higher priority than fentanyl in terms of the dark web. So that cyber investigator position, I think, would be a great career path for the HERO program. In addition, because of the direct hiring authority that ICE has and that HSI has, we would look to expand our cyber portfolio in terms of the cyber investigator position that's a non-law enforcement, non-6C position, but a full-time dedicated support kind of investigator that could add capacity and value to the ongoing investigations in the field. The second part, sir, which I'm glad you mentioned, was the face of mission support to special agents and criminal investigators has changed. You know, obviously, we've gone well beyond the kind of clerk typist, data entry, technical enforcement officer to some degree. Now our agents actually need computer scientists and data scientists to work side by side with them when they're doing these dark web cryptocurrency investigations because of the sheer amount of data. So that would be another area where we'd like to come back and talk to you about what that looks like for our cyber program.
Two things, and I time constraint, but on that note, are there partnerships with other agencies that may have that expertise already that you can piggyback on?
So we're continually, we had a great meeting yesterday with NPPD, obviously part of DHS, very engaged in the cybersecurity and the cyber intrusion work. They have a lot to offer our cyber program as well. So we're continually working with assets within the department. If you talk about working together, we've launched a training program to take the dark web and cryptocurrency cyber training on the road to our state and local partners. So we've trained over 1,200 state and local officers since the president announced the executive order on the opioid crisis back in October, I believe. That's going to continue throughout the year. We're going to move across the country and keep working with our partners. The goal there is to build capacity and share expertise in cyber investigations and darknet investigations.
One other quick thing, I think, on a note on that, thank you, and we'd love to work with you guys at all possible if there's necessary authorities or the need to be able to help deal with any silos that might be there in our whole apparatus. Last thing, you guys do a great job in places like Latin America and going past the border, of course, where the start of some of this stuff is coming, as opposed to just trying to get it when it's here, which you do that as well. On the fentanyl and on the opioid, and of course, like you said, the partnership that you've had with the U.S. Postal Service and the what is it, 3 times the increase of seizures, if you will. Are you talking and having partnerships, or is it happening at all in China with the fentanyl where it's coming from in China, like we do in Latin America?
I can comment on board with the President's focus on countering fentanyl. It's one of his top 3 priorities in engaging the Chinese government. We have seen at our level the customs collaboration.
But we're going to give everybody a chance to go one more time. Just a personal comment. I was sitting here thinking about the comments about when you run across somebody in a raid that has violated the law or failed to appear for a hearing. Every criminal day I ever held, over a 20-year period of time, I forfeited bonds and issued alias capias warrants to pick up people who had failed to appear. And if I ever had heard that one of my officers that answered to our court had failed to, when they stumbled across one of those people to arrest them, I would have been extremely unhappy with them. You can't expect people to make a choice as to which laws they're going to obey and not obey. And I think it's not even an argument that the highest no-show rate of any courts in America today are at our immigration courts. It clearly wins the world championship for no-shows. So I think it is appropriate when you run across those people who have been a no-show for officers to do their duty. I want to talk about ICE detention beds. We've been trying to keep up with ICE detention beds. I totally support ICE on detention beds. I think it is a deterrent. I think it serves a lot of purposes besides deterrence. But we're looking at right now, this would be an increase. What you propose is an 11,480 bed increase of adult detention beds. And I support your mission, and I had a number higher than we came up with in the 18 election. But through negotiations, that changed. Now, you've developed, I think, a pretty good model. You've told us about it. Does your model indicate 52,000 beds is still a correct number? Because we had that number last time as a suggested number. Why are you confident that the associated costs are accurate for the FY19 budget. That's important. We need to know how much this is going to cost us. Please explain the assumptions, pardon me, used to develop the apprehension numbers and whether they are still valid today. And please explain the policy changes you have or will put in place and the assumptions used to develop this number. And are they still valid today?
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to explain our forecasting model. We've worked very hard over the past couple of years with this committee and especially your staffers to help develop a very consistent, logical, transparent model to help project detention space requirements. That's something that your committee made loud and clear to us over the past several years that we need to do a better job of, and our new model, I think, does that. It was used extensively during the FY18 budget negotiation process, where there was a lot of requests from us for additional data. This model is, obviously not getting into the science of it because that's over my head, but it considers all sorts of variables to include averages, trends, seasonality effects, looking at historical data, as well as what's happening today. So a lot of these models, and obviously we built this several years ago, which is why your question is so pertinent, is that the models and what we forecast back then still holds true today. The impact of both ICE arrests, CBP arrests, the requirements that we have in order to detain these individuals before the hearing so we don't have another 50,000 fugitives added to our 540,000 backlog. But the best part about the model is it allows us to factor in operational changes, things like migratory patterns and surges, jurisdictional cooperation, increased enforcement. So, for example, when we forecast this model 2 years ago, we had 32 2A7G partnerships. Right now, we have 76. We'll have 79 by the end of this year. And not all of those are even operational yet. Right now, only 40 of those are operational because they've been recently approved for membership or for partnership. They have to get trained, they have to do the background investigations on the officers. But that's going to lead to a significant increase in arrests coming out of the criminal alien program because those individuals are going to be able to screen 100% of the people that get arrested in those jurisdictions. Not only that, it's a force multiplication benefit because our own officers, our deportation officers that are right now working those jails are going to be able to redeploy to either other facilities, to do additional at-large apprehensions, to work on things like the docket, to move that docket along faster. So and also to take people off the non-detained docket and put them back into custody so we can effectuate removal. So yes, we expect that this number is going to put us right where we need to be for FY19.
Very good. Thank you. Ms. Roble-Allen.
Well, let me begin by saying that I agree with you and my colleague, Dr. Harris, that we should take into account the concerns of sworn law officials and respect the dangerous situations that they face every day. However, based on the rhetoric of this administration, it seems not to appreciate the concerns that many state and local government and law enforcement officials have regarding their more direct association with federal immigration enforcement efforts and how it undermines their safety and that of the public, which becomes increasingly more fearful of reporting crimes and cooperating with criminal investigations. As you know, California has declared itself as a sanctuary state. And I would like to read the directive from the California Department of Justice and ask you to highlight where you see there are weaknesses in that that cause you then to go into the interior, as I understand it from Director Holman, to go after criminals as a result of the state being a sanctuary state. The guidance states that California law enforcement agencies can notify ICE and transfer custody of an individual to ICE if the individual has been convicted at any time of a serious or violent felony or a felony punishable by imprisonment in state prison, has been convicted within the past 15 years of certain other types of felonies or within the last 5 years of crimes punishable as either a felony or a misdemeanor, is a current registrant on the California Sex and Arson Registry, has been convicted of certain federal aggravated felonies under the Immigration and Nationality Act, or has been identified by ICE as the subject of an outstanding federal felony arrest warrant for any federal crime. The guidance also makes clear that California law enforcement officers must be allowed to communicate with federal immigration authorities about the citizenship or immigration status of individuals in their custody as required by federal law. So that is the directive. So my question to you is, where are the weaknesses in this that cause you then to say, or ICE and Director Homeland to say, that because of this directive, whatever the weakness may be that I'm asking you to identify, that we are, California is endangering the lives of ICE officials and the community, because you are then forced to go into the communities, when it clearly states here that felons, well, I don't want to go through the list again, that the law enforcement should be notifying ICE under these conditions.
Thank you. First, I mean, I think it speaks volumes that the California Sheriff's Association came out strongly against the policies and laws that were enacted in the state, because they felt that it undermined public safety. While there are some categories, as you listed, where we can get some cooperation, there are a vast more number of categories where we don't get that cooperation.
Can you highlight a little bit?
I can highlight.
Give me a few, because
Sure.
I'm running out
Well,
of time.
I mean, I could say part of the things, and when we do our work, we don't, again, as I mentioned it, I don't want to beat a dead horse with regard to targeted enforcement, but we don't do random arrests or stops of individuals on the street. We are going after a particular individual. In order for us to do that and to obtain an arrest warrant for somebody, we have to determine two things: alienage and removability. Part of that determination, in many, many cases, is going to require a personal interview. And as was very public in the press, and the sheriff was very vocal about it, we got turned away 10 days in a row going to the Santa Clara County Jail to talk to people that are incarcerated, that we need to make a determination as to whether or not, one, they are an alien, and two, if they're removable. So if we can't even get into that facility to make that.
Let me just stop you there to say, we can both, on both sides, we can cite circumstances where laws or policies haven't been followed. What I'm asking is that what are the weaknesses in the directive, that what should be added in order to address your concerns in a way that also addresses the concerns of many of our local, like the Los Angeles Police Department and others, who have concerns about a more expanded association with ICE. I'm trying to find this out so that I can then talk to them and see if maybe we can find some consensus.
Right, and we're not asking any law enforcement agency to enforce immigration law. We are asking for the same access to information that any other law enforcement agency should have access to. For example, we used to have access to the California Gangs Network. We no longer do as a result of this law. That is a huge public safety risk. We arrested over 5,000 gang members and associates just in a year row, not to mention, I think, close to 5,000 that HSI arrested as well last year. And if we don't even have access to the information as to who's a gang member and where they might reside and who they might be with, that's certainly a public safety risk. And it's clearly a public safety risk for our officer, who used to be able to run background checks on an individual before they go knock on the door and know that he's a gang member, and now they're going there flying blind. That is clearly an officer safety risk.
Okay, so primarily right now you're talking about the gang.
I mean,
Okay.
we can talk about numerous things, but there are so many loopholes that are included in that law with regard to what we can access and the type of cooperation that we receive, I would say that the chilling effect has been on the line officers within the law enforcement agencies within California that would love to help us get these public safety threats out of their community, but are afraid to do so for fear of reprisal from their management and their agencies. That's the chilling effect.
Well, there is definitely a difference of opinion between different law enforcement agencies in California.
Mr. Fleshman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The CPB uses high-accuracy license plate readers, LPRs, at 650 privately owned vehicle lanes and at land ports. It is my understanding that the current models are aging and will soon require replacement. This committee has instructed CPB to pursue LPR modernization, including in the fiscal 2018 omnibus. What is CPB's plan to finally modernize its LPRs at the ports of entry?
Thank you for the question and the committee's support for additional funding to modernize our LPRs. It's a critical tool not only to identify potential security threats that we need to target for greater inspection at a port of entry, but also potential risk to our officers. So we appreciate that support. We received a significant boost in the FY18 enacted that's going to allow us to buy new and modernized equipment and also extend the number of lanes we cover, both at ports of entry and at Border Patrol checkpoints. And we've asked for a continued investment in the FY19 budget to continue that progress.
Thank you, sir. One final question. I've been hearing increasing praise for the mobile surveillance capability. Most recently, it's brought to my attention that the MSC was deployed with incredible success in Puerto Rico, where it's repurposed for coastline surveillance. Have you considered further use of MSCs for U.S. coastline or employing them against the relocatable surveillance system maritime requirement?
Yes, Congressman, you referenced a specific successful pilot we had in Puerto Rico with the MSC, identifying potential small boats out to 13 kilometers and beyond. It worked very well for us. We do think it's an important tool as part of our surveillance capability overall. We could use it in other coastal environments in South Texas and in California as well. And we do have investment requests in the FY19 budget for continued MSC truck capability.
Thank you, and I want to thank each and every one of you all for your outstanding service to the country. You've got a very difficult job, difficult mission, and you've got the support of Congress. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Cuellar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, a matter of perspective, and then I'll ask some specific questions. As you do your work, I just ask you to just keep everything in perspective in the sense that if we look at the border, it's not the way people perceive it to be. I know we got issues and we're working and we want to be supportive. But if you look at the FBI stats on comparing violent crime rates on the Texas border to other cities, the national crime rate is 386.3 per 100,000. That's the national rate. If you look at McAllen, it's 151 per 100,000, which is below the border rate, the national rate. Del Rio's below that. Laredo's below that. And just to pick a couple cities, let's say Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where one of our leaders is from, the violent crime rate there is 1,533, way over the national average. Or you look at Bakerville, California, it's 480, way over the national rate. Or, and I don't see my colleague from Maryland, but if you look at Maryland's figures also, let's say Baltimore, it is 6,619 violent crimes per 100,000 compared to my city of Laredo, 362 per 100,000. So it's all a matter of perspective. And to say that this is the fault of immigrants or other issues like that, we just got to make sure we temper that we don't fall prey to emotion or prejudice that we might have. So I just ask you, as you do your work, just keep that in perspective. So I would ask you a couple things. Mr. Brenner, I really appreciate, Mr. Benner, appreciate that when you're looking at the I-9, it's more of a compliance enforcement is important, but it's more of a compliance. In fact, my office is working with your office for San Antonio, Laredo, and McAllen, working with the Texas Association of Restaurants and Chambers to bring in restaurants. I think we're setting that in a couple of weeks. So I want to thank you for that education so we can make sure our businesses are in compliance. If they're bad apples, you go after them. But I think a lot of them are just trying to get, comply with the law. So I appreciate what we're doing in San Antonio, Laredo, and McAllen. Mr. Balance, I appreciate also yesterday when we were with the Secretary, I asked her, we added 55 immigration judges a couple years ago. We added 10 last year. We added 100 now. One of the things I've asked, and I asked the Secretary, and she agreed with me yesterday, was that we got to get those judges to the border. Sometimes judges want to be in New York, they want to be in Chicago and big cities. But I think if you're going to have the activity at the border, you got to have those immigration judges. We ask for judge teams to make sure we have them. I agree with you. We got to have those attorneys from the Department of Justice to make sure we have everybody there. The last time I talked to Mr. Holman and James McHenry was we needed to get office spaces for the judges. We're trying to get a couple of judges in Laredo, a couple in McAllen, and we got to get them to the border, not away from the border, so we can provide justice. Like you said, if a judge says you stay, you stay. If a judge says you go, then you deport them. But we got to have those judges, and hopefully we can follow up on that conversation. The last point I'd like to bring up, Commissioner, is what we talked about in Laredo. As you know, the committee added language to make a proof of concept, the World Trade Bridge port of entry in Laredo, which is the largest land port that we have, second in the country after L.A., total trade, L.A., then it's Laredo. 14,000 trailers a day. So we got to make sure, following the line that the gentleman brought up a few minutes ago, we got to make sure we have the technology, have the latest technology to do that. But it's not only at the port of entry, and this is, Commissioner, where my question will come in, but also the Charlie checkpoint, which is outside of Laredo. If you will look at that Charlie checkpoint, that Border Patrol checkpoint, and just look at the number of trucks, it would be the fourth largest port of entry if you would just look at trucks. My opinion, and I think we talked about this, the Border Patrol needs some assistance from CBP because they're still doing things that CBP was doing 25 years ago. They're trying to stop every truck. They can't do that every time. They have K-9s. We saw what happened when they had an empty truck that took 100 migrants and they died. Some of them died in San Antonio. So we got to make sure that as we do that proof of concept that we also look at Border Patrol checkpoints, and I appreciate your thought on that.
So first of all, I agree very strongly with the investments and the potential for capability to facilitate truck traffic at our World Trade Bridge and also through the C-29 checkpoint up the road. I think that's one of the promises of a unified border security agency that we haven't fully realized, is that collaboration and applying the best advanced techniques from ports of entry to Border Patrol checkpoints and some of the best advanced techniques from Border Patrol operations back to the ports of entry. I know David Hickerson and Chief Owens in Laredo are very focused on that collaboration. We have some ideas coming forward in modernizing World Trade Bridge that can apply at the checkpoint. I thank you for the question.
Mr. Palacio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When most people think about customs and border protection, they think about border security, but I know we would agree that CBP has a tremendous role in the facilitation of trade. And for years I've been saying I'm all for free trade, but I'm also for fair trade. Within my district, shrimping and lumber are very important industries that are impacted by anti-dumping and countervailing duties. Many companies that engage in unfair trade practices or attempt to get around these duties operate as shell companies, dumping their goods into the U.S. before disappearing and reinventing themselves down the road. I'm hoping y'all are prepared to answer this, but I've been told that the CBP's Office of Trade is working on a project with a number of industry leaders to evaluate the use of third-party data, cognitive computing, and big data analytics to address these challenges, as well as others identified within the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act. I know we're in the middle of that pilot now. Is it possible that anybody could provide me with an update?
Sure. I appreciate the question. Managing $4 trillion in trade crossing our borders and ensuring we address trade enforcement issues like anti-dumping and countervailing duties, the two industries you mentioned are subject to a lot of, evasive or fraudulent trade practices that we absolutely need to address as a team, both identifying at CBP, auditing it, and coordinating with investigative partners like HSI to take action. So you mentioned the pilot to use big data. So our position at the border requires us to collect a lot of information from a regulatory perspective, but we also serve as a single window for the other departments and agencies that have enforcement responsibilities for trade crossing our border. So CBP is that single window with the automated commercial environment. That presents a great opportunity to use advanced techniques, advanced analytics, artificial intelligence to look at that vast array of data, to train it to identify fraudulent practices and address it more aggressively. So we're in the very early stages, just structuring that data so it can be tested appropriately against the algorithms in the big data approach. We'll come back to you and brief you on the success of that. It's something that we want to collaborate closely with HSI on as well.
Well, please do, and thank you for that response. And I know one of my colleagues touched on it, and you were talking about although we know the seizure of drugs is up, it's also more drugs are trying to find its way into America. So it's obvious, your seizures are going to be up. But when we're discussing legal ports of entry, can you tell me what are some of your biggest blind spots that with the funding that we're providing you, how are we going to address trying to, again, my colleague said it well, incorporating technology to help identify drug smuggling and other things that are coming through our legal ports of entry.
So for ports of entry and interdicting narcotics, I'll focus on the land border port of entry. There's really 4 sources for successful interdiction. Good intelligence or investigative leads from our partners or our own targeting units, non-intrusive inspection technology that detects an anomaly in a vehicle, the canines that we have deployed in pre-primary that are very effective tools for us, and then a good officer inspection, asking the right questions, looking for something that doesn't make sense. Those are the 4 sources, and they really find narcotics in roughly equal balance. The place that we think we can make a huge impact with further investment, and that's why the 18 enacted is such a big deal for us on the NII, given the developments in multi-energy portal technology that we can keep a truck driver in the cab in a health safety posture, but then have a really thorough interrogation of that trailer. The same thing for passenger vehicles, getting a good, clean image of that passenger vehicle without slowing it down and removing the driver through portals that can scan that traffic with the travelers in it. Expanding the percentage of traffic that we can inspect through NII is the #1 next step that we think we can take to enhance our drug interdiction at ports of entry, and that's why the support of this committee has been very helpful.
Well, thank you for that response. And again, thank you for what you do. And please allow the people that work with you and under you that we appreciate what they do day in and day out, and their families as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Ruppersberger. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Price. Excuse me, Mr. Price.
Thanks for the try.
Nice try, Dutch. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first clarify this earlier discussion we had about the case I cited and other cases like it. This was not a case of someone not showing up for a scheduled procedure or a required hearing or anything else. This is someone who did show up. And this is increasingly what I'm seeing in cases that come to my attention. These are people who do show up. They check in faithfully with ICE under an order of supervision, and they're picked up at that point. This seems to be something new. That's why I ask about it. It doesn't follow any plan or prioritization of danger to the community that I can see. That's why I would appreciate any further clarification anyone can offer on this. And the case I cited is it's a very dramatic case, just a totally inexcusable case, I think. But I'm afraid there are others like it. Let me turn to the question of border crossings and asylum, Mr. McAleenan, I heard it said earlier that border crossings have begun to rise somewhat in the past 2 months. But it's true, isn't it, that they reached historic lows in 2017 and are still well under the peaks experienced in previous decades. So that needs to be put in perspective. And then I think we need also to ask, who are these people who are arriving at the borders? Large numbers of them, I know, are seeking refuge from poverty and physical danger in their home countries, especially the triangle countries of Central America. And isn't it true that a number of these people are seeking out CBP agents? Not trying to evade them. They're turning themselves in. They're trying to claim asylum. So it does raise the question about whether this is a question of border security at all. What does the National Guard have to do with this? What, for that matter, does a fence have to do with this? Shouldn't we be asking ourselves how to best deal with this issue of rising asylum claims? Also, before he was in this administration, General Kelly used to argue that we needed to pay attention to the conditions in these home countries and what's driving people out of these countries in the first place. But let's just concentrate on what happens when they get here. They're looking for an asylum hearing, and I wonder if we're dealing with that adequately. We are hearing troubling reports that asylum seekers are being turned away at the borders. Under the law, CBP agents are supposed to register asylum requests, take the individual into custody, and then direct them to an asylum officer to assess the validity of their claim. So here's my question, or a series of questions. Of the increased border crossings that DHS reported in March, how many of them are people of the sort I've described? People who voluntarily are turning themselves in to seek humanitarian relief. Are you confident that CBP agents have been properly trained to comply with our laws to ensure the timely and humane processing of all asylum seekers? And can you clarify what you think is actually happening? Can you offer assurances, for example, that people aren't being turned away or turned back without or before they receive a credible fear screening that establishes whether they have a legitimate claim to seek asylum?
Thank you, Congressman. I'll address each of those questions. How many? In March, we had 50,000 either apprehensions between ports of entry or inadmissibles at ports of entry, about 2/3 between, 1/3 at ports of entry. Of those, about 18,500 were either family units or children. The bulk of those crossers were from the Northern Triangle of Central America, as you noted. So it's important to note that the posture of people that we're apprehending or encountering at ports of entry has changed dramatically in the last several years versus the first 13 years of this century. We received asylum claims or fear claims from fewer than 1% of people we apprehended between 2000 and 2013. Now that number is averaging 15 to 20%, and then it goes into ICE custody where additional asylum claims or fear claims are made. So it's a different population, as you note. Am I assured that our officers and agents are approaching their responsibilities and following the law to assess fear claims when people present them at the border? Yes, I am, and it's something that we're focused on ensuring going forward. This is something that we review very carefully. We have strong policies, strong training. We've accepted over 50,000 asylum claims in the last 2 years at our ports of entry. We do hear, as you are alluding to, reports where it has not been handled appropriately. Those reports are immediately referred to our Office of Professional Responsibility, also our Inspector General, and they're followed up on. And we have exacted discipline in cases where it's been substantiated that a case was not handled appropriately. That's very important to us. That's something we need to review. People that are entitled to protections need to be able to claim them appropriately. But it's not a widespread issue. It's not even remotely compared to the numbers that are being processed appropriately for fear. So what's actually happening? You raised some very important points. I heard the chairman note that we have to solve this problem. The current structure of our statute and policy is not encouraging good results. It's inviting asylum seekers to come make a dangerous journey, to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to transnational criminal organizations to put themselves and their children at risk of assault or worse, and really draining the youth and energy of the Northern Triangle countries that you note that General Kelly and myself, Secretary Nielsen, are committed to supporting to enhance their governance, security, and prosperity. So this posture is not achieving good policy results either for these individuals who are seeking help, nor for their countries that need a different approach to governance and security. And that's something that DHS is committed to. So I want to work with you in Congress in my role, supporting the Secretary in her role, to highlight these statutory changes we need and to also continue to invest with partners in the region.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Ruppersberger.
Mr. Chairman, first, the administration has made it a point to secure the southern border, and the President's called for building a 1,000-mile physical wall and a surge in new Border Patrol agents. However, in my opinion, what is missing is more CBP officers. And Mr. McElhinney, I'll be asking you these questions. These CBP officers are essential as there are just as many drugs moving through our official ports of entry as between them. CBP understands this. In their own workload staff model, your agency stated it is in need of 2,516 additional officers. And I've witnessed this firsthand. I represent the Port of Baltimore, which is consistently short CBP officers, and shippers are being asked to compensate CBP for the cost of additional overtime shifts. Furthermore, these officers stationed in Baltimore are already working excessive overtime, and this is seriously impacting the flow of commerce and compromising security throughout the whole country in our ports. Now, the Port of Baltimore is not the outlier here. The chart, I have a chart here in front of me, which paints a really sad picture. In March 2017, there were 200-plus vacancies in Laredo, 250 vacancies in Tucson, and 350-plus in San Diego. Now, I know the committee understands the gravity of the situation. We funded 328 new CBP officers in our omnibus. However, this still leaves a nationwide shortage of 2,200 CBP officers. Now, the question is, does the administration recognize that drugs are moving into this country through our official ports of entry, not just between them? If so, does the President's budget proposal request funding for only 60 CBP hires with none assigned to ports? And that's why I raised the issue of the National Guard, by the way. But managing is a matter of priorities. And, you know, as an example, in Maryland, we have 500 of our National Guard in Estonia dealing with the Russia issue. So there are a lot of priorities. And I think if you're going to do anything, you need a plan, and you need to rely on your experts. But to say one day we're going to put the National Guard, and then you have to take orders, whatever it is, you got to find a way to make sure you do it. And that's why I raised the issue, the National Guard. Well, the administration's favoring of increased Border Patrol agents over Customs officers indicates the President is more concerned with intercepting people instead of drugs, and I think that's wrong. And I'd like to know whether or not you believe what I just said. Now, also, I understand you are stretched thin. I need a commitment maybe from you or whatever that you'll get back, as if you can examine this problem of the drugs versus the people. It seems that we have the people thing under control at the borders. It seems that we have more arrests than we've ever had, but there's a lot of people there. And we have to pick priorities, and we have to have a plan and not just decide decisions based on instincts. Now, so that's my questions, if you could try to answer it, and I would like you to get back to me on how you suggest we deal with this issue of the ports.
Great, thank you. Do we recognize that drugs are coming through ports of entry? Yes, I think I've acknowledged that several times in the testimony and talked about some of our strategies to address that. Are we not asking for or seeking additional CBP officers? No, quite the contrary. You mentioned the workload staffing model. I spearheaded the development of that model when I was in the Office of Field Operations. We're submitting it every year to Congress, and we're submitting, including in the President's budget request, against that, a request for fee increases to keep up even modestly with inflation for our immigration user fee and our customs user fee that would address those hiring needs in the 2,500 that are
over 2,000 jobs.
Absolutely, okay. Just a small increase in each fee of $1 each would have a significant benefit to additional hiring. And we've asked for that every year. There's no intent to not support additional POE hiring, quite the contrary. And the Border Patrol agents are not amenable to a fee-based source for their hiring, for their work. So that we do need the appropriations, and that's why you see that emphasis in the President's budget. I am more than happy to get back in touch with you and examine this problem further. I think the committee's right to highlight the routes for drugs. It's right to highlight the need for CBP officers for both the security and facilitation, and we agree. And I believe the budget request reflects that agreement.
Well, I respect you all, but there are a lot of issues out there. The Commander-in-Chief has a different style, but he's the President, so we have to work through that. And whatever your orders are, your orders are. But if I disagree with him, I'm not going to, as Andy Harris said, personal attacks. I'm going to make a comment, but I'm not going to try to attack him unless I disagree with his comments or his policies. But I do respect you all. You've got a tough job, but you've got to follow orders also. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ruppersberger. One thing I want to point out, those fees are not under our jurisdiction. They fall under Judiciary and Ways and Means, I believe.
Uh-oh.
So that's a little problem for us.
Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Culberson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If those fees ought to be under the subcommittee's jurisdiction, I believe anything that's got a president's portrait on it ought to be under the jurisdiction of the people's elected representatives through this committee. So
you have two chairmen here. You ought to make it happen.
That's it. I'm ready. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your patience. And I was chairing my Commerce, Justice, Science Subcommittee hearing, and over the years that I've had the privilege of representing the people of West Houston, I've discovered if I just make an unannounced trip to the border, that's always one of the best ways to find out what's really going on. And I can assure Mr. Ruppersberger that the human problem is absolutely not solved. It is wide open. It's in the McAllen sector in particular, which I visited most recently. The Border Patrol agents that I went out into the field with, and again, this was an unannounced visit. That's always the best way to do it. We encountered a group of people immediately within a few minutes, and the Border Patrol said, we don't catch them, they catch us. These were individuals with minor children and had come up as far as Guatemala or Central America, paid thousands of dollars. Immediately, they were all obviously coached on what to say. They knew exactly what to say to the Border Patrol agent so they could claim credible fear of persecution. Difficult for me to believe that some of these were actually parents with children. There was one individual who was about 25 years old that claimed the 17 or 18-year-old with him was his son. And the Border Patrol agents, again, said this happens all the time. And the human problem is actually one that is particularly heartbreaking. The drug problem is catastrophic and heartbreaking, but human slavery still exists in this country, and it's trafficking of human beings is a terrible problem. And unfortunately, Houston, Texas is one of the hubs of human trafficking in the country. So I wanted to ask Commissioner McAleenan, and congratulate you on your assignment, that first of all, what is your department doing to restore the integrity of the asylum system to ensure that legitimate trafficking victims who need our help are assisted, while those who are looking to exploit the system by illegally crossing the border and pretending to have fear of persecution are detained swiftly and removed swiftly? What's being done to end the practice of catch and release at the border?
Thank you, Congressman, and appreciate your visits to the border and your longstanding knowledge and especially your emphasis on the importance of consequences for illegal activity on the border. Just on that note, we're the front end of this challenge. We're the border security element catching people crossing the border. And you note sometimes with family units and children, they're not evading capture because they're prepared, coached in some cases, to request protection and to claim fear of return to their home country. When that happens, we turn these individuals over to ICE in the family case for custody, and I'll let my colleagues speak to that. For children, ICE transports them to HHS at the start of their proceeding.
And I found out very quickly as a part of the visit, members, that every single one of those families that sought out a Border Patrol agent, caught them, they're all reached their destination. They were held 48, 72 hours by ICE, but every one of them basically made it to Chicago,
one was going to St. Louis, Atlanta, Miami. They all make it to their destination at U.S. taxpayer expense because of this loophole they found in the system. So what are we doing to close this loophole? And because the magnet, it's putting their lives at risk. These poor kids and these young parents had to come from Central America and Guatemala and threat of assault, rape, murder in order to get here, because they know if they come in and say the right thing, they're going to get to Miami at U.S. taxpayer expense. What's being done to stop that?
So we don't have our colleague Francis Cisna from CIS here, but I'll just speak to the department-wide efforts or administration-wide. This was one of the key areas emphasized by the administration in the immigration discussion in the fall through January. One of the main loopholes that they sought to close to strengthen the asylum process, because what we see are at that front end a very high percentage of people reaching that initial credible fear bar and then waiting for a long time for a judge to eventually resolve that case, where there's a much lower result in terms of getting relief and getting found to have asylum. So that could be years in the U.S.
And 96% of them never show up for their hearing. They're just gone. They're in the United States illegally.
And Chairman made that point earlier. That's a significant challenge in the system as well.
So what are you doing to address that, close that loophole?
Well, number one, the administration is trying to work with Congress to modify the statute. Also with the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, where if you're a Mexican child or a Canadian child and you come across unaccompanied, you can be returned to your country. That's not true for countries further away, including the Northern Triangle of Central America. So that's a key change the administration sought as well.
That's exactly the right answer. Thank you.
If I could just add one thing, please. You know, unfortunately, we're bound by decisions, whether it's a legislative decision or a court decision, with regard to our detention of the family unit. So based on the Flores settlement agreement, we are required to release a family unit within 20 days of them coming into custody. So that is why those individuals that you referenced and that the Border Patrol apprehends is probably the wrong term to use, because they are turning themselves in on a frequent basis. We have no lawful authorization to hold them longer than that 20 days because of this Florida settlement agreement. And as Commissioner McAleenan mentioned, with the UACs, we have no detention authority for a UAC under the TVPRA. That authority lies with HHS. So our role is merely a conduit to get that person from CBP or the Border Patrol over to HHS, and at which point we are no longer involved in that process.
Well, the key is fixing the statute.
Absolutely.
And we're behind you on that. I think we
Appreciate
could
that.
even overturn a settlement, couldn't we, Judge, with a statute?
Well, we, in the bill that we tried to bring to the floor just recently, I have 3 provisions dealing with all 3 of these issues, to fix all 3 of those issues as my part of the contribution. This is the number one thing that needs to be fixed, in my opinion, if it's going to, we're not ever going to stop the flow.
That's right.
We don't plug this hole.
It's a magnet. It's bringing these people in and endangering their lives.
And believe me, a lot of the attractive children are not making it to the border. Ms. Rober-Lowler has some more questions. I think I probably should just yield the floor to her for the rest of the day, but I'll recognize her for one more question at least.
We were just trying to figure out some clarification in terms of the asylum claims and the statistics, because there is a lower threshold with the initial review for a silent claim. And that is, as my understanding is, it's lower because we want to make sure that we are making it possible for those who had valid claims to be able to go through the process and be protected. And then when it goes through the final determination, which is a higher threshold, that it makes sense then that there would be less people who would actually get asylum. So I guess I would disagree that that is a loophole. I think there's a real reason for the lower threshold initially and then the higher one when they get that second review. And so if you have any actual statistics or information on that, I would appreciate it if you would share it. Not at this time, because I know that we're running against the clock here, but I would appreciate it if we could get some more information on that. I also want to clarify with Mr. Albence, to clarify for the record that my question regarding the directive of California's Justice Department was really an attempt to find common ground in protecting our communities, because my constituents and Californians as a whole also want to make sure that dangerous criminals are removed. And I just believe that it would make a lot of sense and benefit everyone, that instead of fighting with each other, fighting with the state of California, that we worked cooperatively to remove individuals who are truly threats to public safety and to our country. So I just wanted to clarify the intent of those questions. Mr. McAleenan, at the end of March, you traveled with Secretary Nielsen to Mexico to meet with your counterparts in that country and with President Peña Nieto. Can you briefly describe what you accomplished during that trip, the challenges that Mexico faces with regards to the influx of refugees and migrants from the Northern Triangle and South America? And can you also comment on areas where you think we are working well with our neighbors to the south and areas where we still need improvement?
Thank you for the question. I was honored to travel and to meet President Peña Nieto, but it's actually my 6th trip in the last 12 months to Mexico to collaborate with partners. With CBP's breadth of our mission, we have stakeholders on the customs side in the department called Hacienda with their tax authority, with their Gobernacion, which is their federal police, their intelligence agencies, as well as, given their security role, their military, Sedena and Semar, and we collaborate really across, and not to mention their agriculture department, Seneca. So we collaborate across the interagency in Mexico. And in March, I got to sign 3 agreements that we had been working on for some period of time. And this is an area that's working very well in our collaboration with Mexican Customs. We're doing unified cargo processing at the border now. So instead of a situation where a truck would have to stop 3 times on its way through in Nogales, outbound Mexican Customs, outbound Mexican Agriculture, and then inbound CBP, we're doing it once together. One of the agreements I signed was with their Agriculture Department, Seneca, to allow this unified cargo processing to be formalized from a pilot to a program, because it's really reducing wait times, in some cases from 3 hours and beyond down to 40 minutes or less for that entire process. So it's benefiting trade between our countries, and it's something we want to continue to emphasize. We also signed an agreement, both CBP and HSI, on trade enforcement. One of your colleagues mentioned the need to address dumping issues. Well, we have shared manufacturing capabilities, things like steel in North America. We know that countries are trying to evade our trade enforcement, and seeing data and sharing it, partnering on enforcement activities and investigations with Mexico is just going to make us more effective in that area. But I want to highlight one piece that you closed on, the partnership with SEGOB and Mexican immigration in particular. They have taken great strides in the last 5 years to enhance the security of their southern border, going from a very small effort to apprehend or return people crossing between ports of entry on their border to upwards of 200,000 in the last couple of years. That's a big change that's enhanced the security of the region. And the more that we can align our migration policies and collaborate in North America, the more effective we're going to be, because these people are paying, unfortunately, thousands of dollars to transnational criminal organizations that are threatening the security of Mexican citizens as they cross through their country. We want to shut that down, and the only way to do it is collaboratively.
Mr. Benner, HSI, as you mentioned earlier, has stepped up its 1-I audits of businesses to determine whether employees are authorized to work. And I know this because a number of the businesses in my district, including one just a few blocks from my district office, were visited recently by HSI officials. And in at least one case, the officials were accompanied by members of the press, which I don't see that as an appropriate thing for ICE to do. And it also concerns me because based on the reaction from the community, I believe that it also serves to unnecessarily scare the public, and it is often misinterpreted as a raid. And we needed to, our office needed to clarify that, in fact, that it was not a raid, that you were doing what, legally that you were authorized to do. And part of it is also, of course, the way sometimes it is reported. And so my question is, does ICE policy permit inviting the press to accompany ICE as it carries out its law enforcement responsibilities? And also, how does HSI determine which states and places of employment to target?
So thank you for the question. So again, as Mr. Alves pointed out, HSI and all of ICE in particular, we certainly do not conduct raids that are indiscriminate or otherwise. In HSI, we execute criminal investigation activity, pursuant to law, and they're well thought out and well planned. I am aware that there are instances where our public affairs departments will authorize ride-alongs for members of the public or the media. So I would like to take that particular instance back and then come brief you more in depth on that particular instance and which case it was, and look into it in that way.
Okay, one of the reasons that I was given was that it was an effort to show the public that there weren't abuses taking place as a result of that. But let me just suggest there may be a better way of doing that, and I'd like to work with you and with ICE on that.
Absolutely. I think it's important to tell the story many times. I do know that in the course of our I-9 work, in one particular case, it was well documented in the media, and HSI agents were actually congratulated by the business owner for being professional, and it was a very low-key process to serve that I-9 inspection, and we're incredibly proud of the men and women of HSI who execute their mission with great care, concern, respect, and with great caution to, as many cases that even in the worksite realm where we have that victim-centered approach. And like I said earlier, the exploitation of unauthorized workers is a top priority for us. Those cases go to the top of the pile every time, because those are the most egregious.
Okay, and the second part, how is that determined? How do you decide either what state or what community is going to be targeted?
So we don't pick communities or states. We pick a broad cross-section of businesses operating in a particular area. Each part of the country has targets based on the size of their AOR and the number of personnel located there. And we let the field, who know their areas of responsibility the best, work through what targets they're going to look at for I-9 inspections. But we also rely on the tip line. We get thousands and thousands of tips coming in from, as you'd be surprised, competitors who feel that they have an unfair advantage because of their company next door that maintains an illicit business model, doesn't pay the same taxes, they don't pay the same wages, they don't pay overtime, and it's hard to compete. Those two companies can't compete with each other. The company that follows the law will lose every time. So we get a lot of complaints from the public. And so we have a national lead development center where we take a look at those tips. We try to use our intel assets to actually make them good leads before we send them to the field. And then that's typically would be the start of the I-9 process, would be to take a look at those leads.
Okay. Does Mr. Culberson have more questions? Okay, and then, you know what, in the interest of time, I will submit the rest of my questions for the record and let Mr. Culberson ask his questions.
Mr. Culberson.
Thank you, and thanks for y'all's patience that I had to get through that CJS hearing. And I wanted to ask Mr. McAleenan about the Criminal Consequence Initiative, otherwise known as Operation Streamline, which is designed to fast-track aliens apprehended at the border to the Department of Justice to be prosecuted for the criminal offense of illegal entry or illegal reentry. And I made certain that the Department of Justice has an increase in funding to hire additional prosecutors, additional staff, additional personnel at the southern border, because it's the magnet. I don't really see it as a loophole. It's a magnet that draws these people in, and they're being assaulted and murdered as they come to the United States through Mexico. If they're from Mexico, the Border Patrol agents have the authority to simply return them immediately back to the border, back to Mexico, put them back across the river. So I hope you'll be able to start doing that for those that are coming up from Central America and elsewhere. One of my, as I said, I like to make unannounced trips to the border. One of the trips I did that I learned the most from is I volunteered to work as a law clerk in the courtroom of Judge Alia Moses in the Del Rio sector under an assumed name. So no one knew who I was. I worked for several days as a law clerk, and it was fascinating, and I learned a great deal. And the DOJ guys didn't find out who I was for about 48 hours. It was right when I became chairman of the subcommittee. And it is, I learned, for example, that one of the statutory changes we need to make is human traffickers, if you're smuggling drugs, your assets can be seized. If you're smuggling human beings, you cannot seize their assets. That's a change that has to be made in the statute. Venue needs to be changed so that when you pick somebody up 25 miles or 50 miles from the border, you can prosecute them in the zone in which they're apprehended. If they're in the United States illegally, you can't prosecute them under the venue statute. We need to fix that as well, Judge. But what I discovered also is that Judge Moses, and by the way, I hope the Trump administration will consider appointing her to the Fifth Circuit. She does a superb job. She enforces the law, 1325 and 1326. She gives some consequence to everybody that comes in. And whether it be a week, a few days, they've got a conviction, and is able to do so in a way that protects everybody's constitutional rights, and it works. So when the illegal crossings in the Del Rio sector are the lowest they've ever seen because of Operation Streamline and Judge Moses' enforcement of the law. And so I wanted to ask, Commissioner, about Operation Streamline, and how, if you could, update me on records that I have from, I think I'm a couple of years out of date on these, on the number of people, of those that are apprehended in each sector. What percentage of those who are apprehended are actually referred to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution? I remember being astounded when I first started looking about a decade ago when Judge and I first got on this subcommittee that in the Tucson sector, only about 4% of those apprehended were being prosecuted. In the McAllen sector, about 11%. But in Judge Moses' sector, she prosecutes 70%. Anybody that's caught in the Del Rio sector is going to get prosecuted. There's going to be a consequence. As a result, illegal crossings have plummeted. I also learned by sitting there and asking questions, the magistrate was asking questions for me that I was typing to him as a law clerk, that these poor people were paying $5,000 to $6,000 apiece to get here from Guatemala, that the drug cartels were charging them $500 to $1,000 to get them across the river, and then just dumping them in the desert. With no food, no water, these people had no idea where they were, and you couldn't touch the smugglers. So what can you tell me about what you're doing to expand Operation Streamline, to duplicate what Judge Moses is doing in the Del Rio sector, up and down the entire border, and what can I do as chairman of the Commerce Justice Science Subcommittee to help ensure the Department of Justice is deploying resources to support your work in referring these folks for prosecution?
Let me just first thank you, Congressman, for your longstanding support for our consequence delivery system and the Criminal Consequence Initiative Streamline. Didn't know you actually had helped Judge Moses out with some of those cases, but you noted that Del Rio is an area where we have a very high percentage of acceptance of referrals for immigration violations for prosecution. I don't know if you saw yet a letter issued by the Attorney General directing his U.S. attorneys to increase acceptance of immigration violations, zero tolerance memo. We'll be meeting with them this afternoon on opportunities for increased consequences for immigration violations that can create a sufficient deterrent. We have seen a direct correlation between the consequence delivery system and reductions in recidivism and repeat attempts at crossing our border illegally. We know it works. We want to apply it in smart ways, appropriate for the individual that we've encountered or apprehended. But I'd be happy to get back to you with in-depth data on this initiative, and especially as we continue to engage the Department of Justice in improving our efforts.
the prosecution rates by sector of those you apprehend, and please ask Department of Justice what, if any, additional resources they need, because fundamentally, this is a law enforcement issue, Judge. It's just a matter of letting the officers enforce the law with a compassionate heart and good common sense to distinguish between the MS-13 member or someone smuggling guns or drugs, smuggling humans, versus the economic migrant versus a young woman. You want the officers to use their good heart and their good sense. Law enforcement works, and this is a law enforcement issue. Respect for the law, that's one thing this president is doing. Restoring respect for the law, respect for our military, and respect for the United States around the world is one of the most important things that this president is doing, and that's why he was elected. And we look forward to helping you, as I know you know Judge Carter and this subcommittee is committed to helping you restore respect for the rule of law at the border. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And if you see a guy that looks like Culberson and camouflage out in the bushes, it probably is. Okay.
New intern.
You never know. We're going to conclude the hearing now. Thank you very much. Well done. Good answers. Remember, we are part of a team. Keep us informed. If you have needs, don't hesitate. Call me. Call Lucille. Okay? Okay, we're recessed.